Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to 1850 seconds London. So dim the lights, unclench your jaw, let your phone slip face down on the nightstand, because we're about to spend a very long, very calm evening talking about rules. Endless rules, polite rules, rules about how to breathe incorrectly in public. This is Victorian London, after all, a city powered by coal, smoke, social anxiety, and an almost athletic fear of doing the wrong thing at dinner. Now, when people imagine the Victorians, they tend to picture stiff people in stiff clothes, standing stiffly, judging each other. And honestly, that's not wrong, but it's also incomplete. Because beneath the starch and the silence was a population absolutely obsessed with being seen as respectable while quietly unraveling behind closed doors, which makes this era perfect bedtime material. Low energy chaos, the best kind. So let's ease into it. London in the 1850 seconds was enormous, loud, crowded, and smelled aggressively like horse opinions. The population had exploded thanks to industrialization, which meant millions of people were suddenly living on top of one another, pretending not to notice each other, and competing in the social Olympics of who can be the most proper human being. And proper behavior mattered a lot because in Victorian society, manners weren't just manners, they were survival tools. Your accent, your posture, how fast you walked, how loudly you laughed, whether you made eye contact for half a second too long, all of it quietly placed you on an invisible ladder. And everyone knew exactly where they stood, even if they pretended not to. Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand that Victorian social rules were not written down in one neat manual. They existed in a thousand unspoken expectations, passed down by raised eyebrows, silences, and that particular look that says, we don't do that here. And if you broke the rules, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no scene, just a slow, polite-social death, which somehow feels worse. Let's start at the foundation of Victorian daily life. Respectability. Respectability was the holy grail. Everyone wanted it. No one could ever be sure they had it. It meant appearing moral, restrained, clean, and emotionally manageable at all times. Not happy, not relaxed, manageable. And this applied especially to the middle classes, who were deeply anxious about falling downward socially or being mistaken for someone who worked with their hands. Tragic. To be respectable, your life had to follow a very specific rhythm. You woke up at the right time. You dressed correctly for the time of day. You spoke carefully. You ate meals at socially approved hours. You visited people only when allowed. And yes, there were rules for visiting. You couldn't just go to someone's house. That would be unhinged behavior. Instead, you left a calling card, a small, tasteful rectangle of paper with your name on it. You handed it to the servant, and then you waited. If the card was returned with a corner folded down, congratulations, you were welcome. If nothing happened, that was the Victorian equivalent of being left unread. And heaven help you if you showed up at the wrong time of day. Morning visits were ruder. Evening visits required an invitation. Afternoon visits were acceptable, but only during very specific hours, usually between 3 and 5, because apparently no one had anything better to do between 3 and 5. Now let's talk about clothing, because Victorian social rules loved clothing, absolutely obsessed. Your outfit had to match not only your class, but the time of day, the weather, the occasion, and your emotional state. There were clothes for walking, clothes for visiting, clothes for dining, clothes for mourning, and clothes for half mourning, which is exactly what it sounds like. Wearing the wrong fabric at the wrong hour was a quiet scandal. Imagine someone thinking she's wearing silk before sunset and just never forgiving you. For men, the rules were slightly less exhausting, but still rigid. Dark suits, muted colors, clean lines, no unnecessary flair. Looking fashionable was acceptable. Looking like you were trying was not. For women, clothing was an endurance sport. Corsets, layers, heavy skirts, sleeves that restricted movement just enough to remind you not to gesticulate like an emotional person. The goal was to look effortless while suffering quietly, a timeless concept, and posture mattered a lot. Slouching suggested laziness, leaning suggested familiarity, crossing your legs too aggressively suggested opinions. Standing straight wasn't about health, it was about moral fiber. Because, of course, it was. Now let's drift gently into the Victorian home. The home was supposed to be a sanctuary, a moral fortress, a place where the chaos of the outside world could not enter, which is ironic because Victorian homes were full of coal dust, lead paint, questionable plumbing, and at least one family secret everyone agreed not to discuss. But socially speaking, the home was sacred, especially the parlor. The parlor was the most important room in the house. It existed almost entirely for display. Guests were received there. Music was performed there. Conversation happened there. You did not relax in the parlor. Relaxation happened elsewhere, quietly, when no one could see it. The furniture was arranged carefully. Everything had a purpose, and nothing was meant to be touched casually. Children, in particular, were decorative but inconvenient. They were expected to be seen briefly and heard never. Ideally, they appeared clean, spoke politely, and then vanished. Which brings us neatly to Victorian children. Despite the popular image of rosy cheeked innocence, Victorian childhood was restrained. Children were miniature adults in training. Their behavior reflected directly on their parents' respectability. Running indoors was unacceptable. Talking too loudly was unacceptable. Interrupting adults was practically a crime. Emotions were discouraged, especially strong ones. Calm child was a good child. A quiet child was a successful parenting project. And affection was minimal, not absent, just carefully rationed. Hugging existed, but not excessively. Praise existed, but sparingly. The idea was to mold character, not inflate ego, which explains a lot about future Victorian adults. Now let's talk about meals, because Victorian dining etiquette could fill several lifetimes. Meals were structured, formal, and emotionally neutral. You sat up straight. You waited to be served. You used the correct utensils in the correct order. And there were many utensils: forks, knius, spoons, fish knius, dessert forks, oyster forks, each one designed to prevent you from touching food like an animal. Chewing quietly was essential. Talking with food in your mouth was unacceptable. Reacting strongly to the taste of anything was deeply suspicious. If the food was bad, you pretended it was fine. If the food was good, you pretended it was adequate. Because enthusiasm was vulgar, conversation at the table was polite, controlled, and carefully curated. Politics were risky, religion was risky, anything personal was risky. Safe topics included weather, travel, and vague references to current events without opinions attached. Disagreeing openly was rude. Arguing was unthinkable. The goal was harmony, or at least the appearance of it. And then there was tea. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a performance, a daily exercise in controlled sociability. Afternoon tea followed strict rules. Tea was poured by the hostess, milk or lemon, but never both, stirring quietly. No clinking, and absolutely no slurping. Tea was where relationships were maintained, judged, and quietly adjusted. A slightly delayed invitation could mean something. A missing invitation meant everything. Now, as the evening drifts on, let's gently touch on gender expectations. Men were expected to be rational, restrained, and emotionally distant. Women were expected to be moral, nurturing, and emotionally contained. Everyone was supposed to know their place and stay in it politely. Women managed the home. Men managed the public world. Crossing those boundaries made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't fully articulate. A woman expressing ambition was unsettling. A man expressing vulnerability was awkward. So both learned not to. And finally, let's end this first stretch by acknowledging the unspoken truth of Victorian social rules. Almost no one actually lived up to them perfectly. Everyone slipped. Everyone failed. Everyone whispered about everyone else. The rules weren't about perfection. They were about performance. As long as you looked respectable, you could survive, even thrive. And beneath the silence, beneath the starch, beneath the carefully folded calling cards, Victorian London hummed with quiet tension. But don't worry, we're just getting started. So take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop. In the next part, we'll drift further into daily routines, emotional restraint, and the strange art of saying absolutely nothing extremely well. So, let's continue. No sudden movements, just a slow glide deeper into the Victorian day. By the 1850 seconds, life in London followed a rhythm that was rigid, predictable, and quietly exhausting. People liked it that way. Routine was comforting. Routine suggested order. Order suggested morality. And morality suggested you were better than someone else, which was the real prize. The Victorian day began early, especially for anyone who wanted to appear industrious. Sleeping late was suspicious. It implied idleness, or worse, self indulgence. Middle and upper class households woke the servants already moving softly through the house, opening curtains, lighting fires, and pretending not to exist. Servants were expected to be invisible but omnipresent, a difficult balance. You were supposed to notice the results of their work, but not the work itself. Seeing a servant resting was uncomfortable. It raised questions no one wanted to answer. Breakfast was a quiet affair, not a family bonding moment, just full. Conversation was minimal and practical. Children might appear briefly, properly dressed, hair smoothed into submission before being escorted away to lessons. Education was serious business, but not creative. Creativity was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Boys learned discipline, classics, and how to suppress fear. Girls learned accomplishments, music, drawing, French, skills designed to make them pleasant, not powerful. Too much intelligence in a woman was unsettling. It suggested thoughts, and thoughts led to opinions, which led to discomfort. As the day moved on, the house settled into a controlled quiet. Men left for work, armed with hats, gloves, and the emotional range of a teaspoon. Public life was competitive, hierarchical, and relentlessly judgmental. But at least there were rules. Rules were easier than feelings. Women remained at home, managing domestic affairs with an iron hand wrapped in lace. Running a household was complex. Budgets, servants, meals, social schedules. It was unpaid labor, endlessly judged, and taken completely for granted. A well run home reflected the woman's moral worth. If something went wrong, it was her fault. If everything went right, it was expected. Visitors might arrive in the afternoon, or rather, their cards would arrive. Actual people were optional. Calling hours were sacred. Too early, and you were intrusive. Too late, and you were presumptuous. Arriving without notice was practically feral behavior. When visits did occur, they were short, polite, and emotionally restrained. Chairs were chosen carefully. Distance mattered. Sitting too close suggested intimacy. Sitting too far suggested coldness. Everything existed in a narrow band of acceptability. Conversation followed familiar paths. Health inquiries that did not invite real answers. Compliments that required immediate deflection. Modest self criticism was mandatory. Accepting praise outright was embarrassing. If someone said your home was lovely, you were expected to insist it was quite shabby, actually. This ritual could go on for some time. Everyone knew the script, everyone played their part. Now let's talk about emotional control. Because Victorian society loved emotions, as long as they stayed theoretical, public displays of feeling were discouraged. Strong reactions were seen as a lack of discipline. Crying in public was mortifying. Anger was vulgar. Joy needed to be contained. Even grief had rules. Mourning was structured, timed, and color coded. Black clothing for full mourning, muted shades for half mourning. The duration depended on your relationship to the deceased. Too little mourning suggested coldness. Too much suggested instability. There was a correct amount of sadness. Anything beyond that was inconvenient. This emotional restraint shaped everything. Marriages were polite partnerships. Affection existed, but quietly. Love letters were careful and coded. Passion was implied, not described. Public flirtation was unacceptable. Private flirtation was risky. Reputation was fragile. Once damaged, it rarely recovered. Women, especially, lived under constant scrutiny. A rumor could undo years of careful behavior. A glance held too long. A walk taken alone. A laugh heard at the wrong moment. None of it meant anything, but it could mean everything. Men had more freedom, but not complete immunity. Scandal was tolerated only if discreet. Being caught was the real crime. Now let's gently drift toward the evening. Dinner was the most formal meal of the day. It required preparation, proper attire, and mental stamina. Clothing changed. Hands were washed. Conversation, expectations reset. Dinner parties were performances. Hosts planned seating carefully. Who sat next to whom mattered. Age, status, marital status, and temperament were all considered. The goal was balance. No awkward silences. No excessive enthusiasm. Wine loosened tongues slightly, but not enough to cause honesty. After dinner, men withdrew to smoke and discuss serious matters. Women remained behind, continuing polite conversation. This separation was normal, comfortable. Questioning it would have been strange. Later, everyone might reconvene for music or quiet entertainment. A piano piece, a reading, something soothing and respectable, nothing too exciting. Excitement suggested recklessness. As the evening ended, guests departed with careful expressions of gratitude. No one overstayed. Overstaying was a sin. And finally, the house settled into silence again. The day complete. Another successful performance of normalcy. And that's the thing to remember. Victorian social rules weren't just about politeness, they were about control. Control over space, over time, over emotion. In a city that was growing faster than anyone could manage, rules were a way to feel safe, predictable, superior, and a little less afraid. So as you rest there, letting the quiet settle in, remember that behind every stiff collar and polite smile was a human being trying very hard not to do the wrong thing. And tomorrow, they do it all again. So we keep going, slowly, calmly, without changing the lighting. Victorian London outside the home was a different kind of performance. Public spaces were crowded, loud, and unpredictable, which made social rules even more important. The street was not a place to relax. It was a place to be observed. Every movement mattered. Walking too quickly suggested anxiety. Walking too slowly suggested idleness. Stopping suddenly was inconsiderate. Looking around too much suggested curiosity, which was dangerously close to nosiness. Proper walking involved a steady pace, eyes forward, expression neutral. You were meant to appear as though you belonged there, even if you absolutely did not. Eye contact was brief and controlled. Staring was rude. Avoiding all eye contact was suspicious. Again, the narrow band of acceptability. Greetings in public were minimal. A small nod, a slight lift of the hat. Anything more was unnecessary. Anything less was cold. Conversation in the street was discouraged. The street was for movement, not connection. If you wished to speak at length, you did it indoors, behind closed doors, preferably with tea involved. Public transportation came with its own rules. Omnibuses and trains forced people into close proximity, which Victorians found deeply uncomfortable. Politeness became defensive. No spravling, no unnecessary touching. Apologies were frequent and quiet. Everyone pretended not to notice everyone else. Silence was a kindness. Now let's talk about class, because Victorian social rules were built on it. Class was not just about money, it was about behavior, accent, vocabulary, taste. You could gain wealth quickly, but respectability lagged behind. The newly rich were watched closely. Too much display was tacky. Too little suggested insecurity. They had to learn the rules fast or be quietly excluded. The working classes had their own codes, but they were judged constantly by those above them. Cleanliness was moralized. Poverty was treated as a personal failure. Sympathy existed, but it was conditional and distant. Charity was acceptable. Empathy was risky because empathy blurred boundaries, and boundaries were everything. Let's drift into leisure because even relaxation had rules. Free time existed, but it had to be purposeful. Idle pleasure was frowned upon. Acceptable leisure included reading, improving literature, walking, needlework, or listening to music. Anything too frivolous suggested weak character. Games were allowed, but not gambling. Sports were acceptable, but not excessive enthusiasm. Laughter was fine, but not loud. Always moderated, always contained. The theater was popular, but moral judgment followed closely behind. Certain performances were respectable. Others were not. Attendance itself sent a message. Who you were seen with mattered as much as where you went. Reputation traveled faster than people. Now let's gently move towards social anxiety because it was everywhere. Victorians worried constantly about being improper without realizing it. There was no universal agreement on every rule. Guides existed, etiquette books were popular, but they didn't cover everything. So people watched each other closely, copied behavior, adjusted constantly. Social life was a careful dance of observation and imitation. Mistakes happened. A wrong fork, a misused comment, a poorly timed visit. Most errors were met with silence, which was worse than correction. Silence meant judgment had occurred privately, and you would never know how badly you'd failed. This fear kept people compliant, careful, exhausted. Now let's talk about speech. Victorian conversation avoided extremes. You did not dominate discussion. You did not withdraw completely. You contributed politely, briefly, and without revealing too much. Personal struggles were not shared openly. Illness was mentioned vaguely. Mental distress was ignored entirely. Admitting unhappiness was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Better to keep things pleasant, even when they were not. This restraint created a strange emotional flatness, not joyless, just muted. Feelings existed, but under layers of control. People learned to live with quiet dissatisfaction, to endure rather than confront, which brings us gently to loneliness. Victorian society was social, but not intimate. Many people were surrounded by others and still deeply isolated. Friendships were polite. Marriages were practical. Families were formal. True emotional closeness was rare and often unspoken. But this was normal, expected. Complaining about it would have been inappropriate. And so people adapted. They found comfort in routine, in structure, in rules that told them who they were allowed to be. And as the city grew dark outside, lit by gas lamps and blurred by smoke, these rules created a kind of quiet order, restrictive, suffocating, but familiar. So just rest there with that thought. A world held together not by joy or freedom, but by careful behavior and mutual surveillance. And in the next part, we'll slowly drift into relationships, marriage expectations, and the long, polite negotiation of human connection. We continue unhurried, steady, exactly as before. Victorian relationships were not built on spontaneity. They were built on caution. Every interaction between unmarried men and women was monitored, interpreted, and quietly evaluated. Romance existed, but it was restrained, filtered through etiquette, and supervised whenever possible. Courtship was a process, not a feeling, and it began with observation. A young woman did not simply meet someone, she was introduced. Introductions mattered. Who introduced you mattered even more. A poor introduction could limit your entire social future. Once introduced, interactions followed strict rules. Private meetings were inappropriate. Unchaperoned conversations were risky. Letters were acceptable, but often read by others. Privacy was a privilege, not a right. Public behavior during courtship was subtle. No overt displays of affection, no dramatic gestures. A walk together, carefully timed, a shared conversation at a gathering, never too long. Interest was shown through consistency, not intensity. Anything intense suggested poor self control. Women were expected to be receptive but reserved. Too eager was improper. Too distant was discouraging. Men were expected to pursue, but gently. Aggression was frowned upon. Indecision was mocked. It was a narrow path. Everyone knew it. Marriage itself was treated as a serious contract. Love was desirable, but compatibility was essential. Family approval mattered enormously. Marrying beneath your class was a scandal. Marrying above it was suspicious. Marrying within it was safest. Financial stability was crucial. Romantic passion without income was considered reckless. Engagements were formal and deliberate. Once engaged, behavior changed. More freedom, but still limited. The engagement period allowed families to observe, assess, and occasionally panic. Breaking an engagement was humiliating, especially for women. Reputation damage lingered. Marriage, once achieved, brought respectability. For women, it was a transition from daughter to wife, with authority exchanged rather than expanded. Married women managed households, hosted events, and represented their families socially. Their success reflected on their husbands. Men gained stability and status through marriage. A well managed wife was a social asset. Public affection between spouses was minimal. Love was private. At least in theory, marriages varied widely in happiness, but dissatisfaction was rarely discussed. Endurance was valued. Adaptation was praised. Complaining was undignified. Divorce existed, but was rare, expensive, and scandalous. Separation was sometimes tolerated as long as discretion was maintained. Again, appearance mattered more than truth. Friendships outside marriage were important but limited. Close friendships between women were common and emotionally significant. Between men as well. These relationships provided intimacy that marriage often lacked, but they too followed rules. Public displays were restrained. Letters could be affectionate but coded. Anything too intense invited speculation, and speculation was dangerous. Victorian society thrived on speculation. Gossip was quiet, controlled, and constant. Reputations were built and damaged through whispers. Information moved efficiently without anyone admitting responsibility. Being talked about was inevitable. Being talked about badly was catastrophic. So people learned to be careful, measured, predictable, and in that predictability, many found a strange comfort. The rules told them what was expected, what was allowed, what was forbidden. They limited choice, but reduced uncertainty. And as relationships formed and dissolved within these boundaries, life continued its steady rhythm, controlled, polite, contained. So rest with that for a moment. Human connection reduced to something manageable, not wild, not overwhelming, just enough to function. And next, we'll gently move into morality, reputation, and the exhausting effort of being considered a good person in Victorian London. We keep moving, same pace, same volume, no surprises. Victorian morality was not a quiet background concept. It was a public performance, a shared agreement that everyone would pretend to be morally upright all the time, with varying degrees of success. Morality in the 1,850 seconds was tightly bound to appearance. Being good mattered, but looking good mattered more. Private behavior was only an issue if it became public. Discretion was the real virtue. This created a strange moral ecosystem where sins were tolerated as long as they were managed correctly. Respectable society did not demand purity, it demanded control. Religion played a central role, but even faith followed social rules. Church attendance was expected. not necessarily deep belief, just presence. Being seen at church was reassuring. It signaled stability, conformity, and an appropriate concern for one's soul. Different denominations existed, but deviation from the norm invited quiet judgment. Too much enthusiasm suggested fanaticism. Too little suggested moral laziness. Once again, moderation was the goal. Sunday itself was governed by rules. It was a day of rest, but not pleasure. Work was restricted. Entertainment was subdued. Noise was frowned upon. Children were expected to be calmer than usual, which was ambitious. The day carried a heavy seriousness that everyone politely endured. Reputation, meanwhile, was fragile and cumulative. It was built slowly and destroyed quickly. A lifetime of proper behavior could be undone by a single incident, especially for women. Female respectability was tied closely to sexual purity, or at least the convincing appearance of it. Rumors alone could be damaging. Proof was unnecessary. Men faced fewer restrictions, but were not immune. Financial irresponsibility, public drunkenness, or open scandal could still tarnish a man's standing. Again, being caught was worse than the act itself. The press played an increasing role in moral surveillance. Newspapers reported on scandals with polite wording and unmistakable implication. Names were sometimes omitted. Everyone knew anyway. Public shaming did not require explicit detail. A raised eyebrow in print was enough. Charity was another major moral obligation. The Victorians believed strongly in helping the poor, but in a controlled way. Charity was structured, supervised, and moralized. The poor were expected to be grateful, deserving, and reformable. Aid came with conditions. Sympathy without judgment was rare. Giving alms demonstrated virtue. Understanding poverty was optional. This approach reassured the middle and upper classes that inequality was unfortunate but manageable. Moral superiority softened discomfort. It also justified distance. Personal habits were scrutinized closely. Drinking was acceptable, but excess was shameful. Smoking was tolerated for men. Women smoking was controversial. Deed reflected character. Overindulgence suggested weak self control. Thinness suggested discipline. Health became a moral issue. Illness was sometimes interpreted as failure, especially illnesses of the nerves or mind. Mental health was poorly understood and quietly ignored. Emotional distress was reframed as moral weakness or personal failing. Better to endure than admit struggle. Public behavior reflected inner worth. At least that was the theory. This belief placed enormous pressure on individuals to self regulate constantly. Thoughts had to be managed, expressions filtered, instincts suppressed. Children absorbed these expectations early. They learned not just what to do, but what not to feel. Shame became a powerful motivator, not loud shame, quiet shame, the kind that settled in and stayed. Moral instruction was everywhere. Books, pamphlets, lecture, advice manuals. Everyone was being guided, corrected, and improved at all times. Self improvement was endless. You were never finished. There was always something to refine. Some people found comfort in this structure. Rules offered clarity, certainty, a sense of order in a rapidly changing world. Others felt suffocated. But voicing that discomfort would have been inappropriate. Better to keep it to oneself. This moral rigidity also created hypocrisy. People preached restraint while indulging privately. condemned behavior they quietly practiced, maintained appearances while compartmentalizing reality. It was not unusual. It was normal. Victorian society ran on this contradiction, public virtue, private complexity. As long as the boundary held, everything functioned. When it broke, consequences followed: social exclusion, loss of reputation, a slow fade from polite society. People learned to fear that fade, to avoid it at all costs. And so morality became a constant background effort, a full time job layered on top of daily life, always monitoring, always adjusting, always careful. So just sit with that for a moment. A city full of people trying very hard to be good, or at least appear so, while quietly managing all the ways they fell short. And next, we'll drift toward the end of the day and the end of the era's patience, touching on fatigue, quiet rebellion, and the slow cracks forming beneath all that careful behavior. We keep drifting, same calm pace, nothing sharp or sudden. By the 1850 seconds, the Victorian system of rules had been in place long enough for people to start feeling tired, not dramatically tired, just worn down in a polite, well dressed way. Living under constant self surveillance required energy, and even the most disciplined society eventually runs low on it. This fatigue showed up quietly, not as rebellion, but as small adjustments. Tiny permissions people gave themselves when no one was watching: a slightly louder laugh at home, a private indulgence no one discussed, an opinion shared only with a trusted friend. These moments didn't overthrow the system, they just made it survivable. Many Victorians lived double lives, not scandalous ones necessarily, just divided ones. Public restraint, private release. The contrast became normal, expected even as long as the boundary stayed intact. Home, for some, became a space where rules softened slightly, still structured, still controlled, but less performative. Slippers replaced boots, voice lowered, postures relaxed, a fraction. Even this small shift felt significant. For others, escape came through imagination. Reading was enormously popular. Novels offered emotional experiences real life discouraged: love, conflict, desire, all safely contained on the page. Critics worried novels overstimulated readers, especially women. Too much feeling was dangerous, which, of course, made novels irresistible. Music served a similar purpose. Playing or listening allowed expression without confession, emotion without explanation, a useful loophole. Art, poetry, and quiet hobbies became acceptable outlets as long as they remained tasteful. Taste solved everything. Social gatherings also shifted subtly, still formal, still polite, but increasingly complex. People grew skilled at saying nothing while meaning something. Conversation became layered. A comment could carry approval, disapproval, or warning depending on tone. Subtext thrived. This indirect communication reduced open conflict but increased anxiety. Everyone was always interpreting, guessing, replaying conversations afterward, wondering if they'd said too much or not enough. Exhausting, but familiar. You get used to anything eventually. You can even mistake it for normal. Younger generations began to feel the weight more strongly. Children raised under strict emotional control sometimes questioned it quietly, not aloud, just internally. They followed the rules, but without the same certainty. The structure remained, but faith in it weakened. Education expanded, Literacy increased, ideas traveled faster, exposure widened perspectives, careful thought crept in. This didn't lead to immediate change. Victorian society was durable, flexible enough to absorb discomfort without collapsing. But cracks appeared, small ones, barely visible. Work culture contributed to the strain. Industrial schedules were rigid. Time itself became regulated. Punctuality was moralized. Being late suggested irresponsibility. Clocks ruled daily life. The natural rhythm of the body mattered less than the schedule. This created a constant low level tension, always watching the time, always adjusting. Leisure became more precious because it was limited. Moments of rest were cherished quietly, not announced, not flaunted, just taken. People learned to enjoy subtle pleasures. A warm room, a familiar routine, predictability itself became comforting, which explains why change was so unsettling. Anything new threatened the fragile balance. New behaviors, new fashions, new ideas, they were met with caution, sometimes hostility. Better the known discomfort than the unknown alternative. This mindset shaped responses to social issues. Reform movements existed, but were carefully framed. Too radical, and they were dismissed. Too emotional, and they were suspect. Change had to look respectable to be accepted. Even compassion needed approval. Mental health struggles remained largely invisible. People endured silently. Symptoms were minimized. Treatment was limited. Admitting distress risked social consequences. Better to appear functional, even when barely holding together. This endurance was praised. Resilience became a virtue. Suffering quietly was admirable. Relief was secondary. Over time, this created a culture skilled at suppression. Emotion didn't disappear. They just went underground, manifesting as fatigue, irritability, melancholy, but rarely discussed directly. Social etiquette discouraged introspection. Better to focus outward, on duties, on appearances, on maintaining order. As the day ended, evenings offered the final stretch of performance. Social obligation fulfilled, proper goodbyes exchanged, lights dimmed. The city settled into a quieter version of itself. Gas lamps glowing, streets less crowded, homes closing in on themselves. Night provided anonymity, a brief relief from observation. Sleep was restorative, but never fully free. Tomorrow would bring the same expectations, the same careful navigation. Most people accepted this, not happily, not unhappily, just practically. Life was not expected to be fulfilling, it was expected to be respectable. That distinction mattered. And so Victorian society continued, held together by habit, fear of judgment, and a shared understanding of the rules. People found meaning where they could, in routine, in duty, in quiet moments of selfhood no one else saw. As we pause here, let that settle. A world not collapsing, not thriving, just continuing, functioning through discipline and denial. And in the next part, we'll gently observe how these rules shaped identity itself, how people learned who they were by who they were allowed to be, and how Victorian life quietly trained generations to live within limits without ever calling them limits. We continue gently, no change in pace, no sharp turns. By the time someone reached adulthood in 1850 seconds London, the rules were no longer something they consciously thought about. They were internal, automatic, a reflex Victorian society didn't just tell people how to behave, it taught them who they were allowed to be. Identity was shaped early and reinforced constantly. From childhood, people learned which traits were admirable and which were dangerous. Calm was good, restraint was good, ambition was acceptable, but only in approved directions. Anything excessive needed trimming. Personality itself became something to manage. People edited themselves before speaking, before reacting, before even thinking. Sometimes this wasn't usually experienced as oppression, it felt like maturity. Self control was framed as growth, emotional containment was framed as strength. Learning not to want too much was considered wisdom. And because everyone around you reinforced this idea, it felt natural, normal. Questioning it would have required language most people didn't have. Social roles provided structure. You were a gentleman, a wife, a daughter, a clerk, a servant. Each role came with expectations that simplified decision making. You didn't need to wonder how to behave. The script already existed. Following it reduced risk. Stepping outside it invited attention, and attention was rarely kind. Class identity was especially powerful. People learned to recognize their place instinctively, where they could go, who they could speak to, what they could aspire to. This knowledge was not always taught directly. It was absorbed through observation, through correction, through silence. You learned when a conversation ended abruptly, when an invitation never came, when a smile cooled slightly. These were lessons, clear if you knew how to read them. Victorians became highly skilled at reading rooms, at sensing disapproval before it was spoken. This awareness shaped self perception. People adjusted themselves preemptively, better to shrink a little than risk standing out, better to soften opinions than defend them. Over time, this produced a population that valued composure above authenticity. Being true to oneself was not a common goal. Being acceptable was. Even happiness was filtered through respectability. Joy was allowed, but only in controlled doses. Too much enthusiasm raised eyebrows. Too much passion suggested instability. People learned to enjoy things quietly, internally, without display. Ambition followed similar rules. Men were encouraged to succeed, but not boast. Women were encouraged to support, not pursue. Wanting too much, especially as a woman, was seen as dangerous. Desire itself became something to manage carefully. Private journals and letters revealed this tension. People wrote about longing, frustration, loneliness, but these feelings rarely crossed into public life. They stayed contained on paper or unspoken entirely. Marriage reinforced identity limits. Spouses became reflections of each other's respectability. Individual quirks were softened for the sake of harmony. Conflict was managed indirectly. Silence was often preferred to confrontation. Over time, people became adept at living with unresolved feelings. They didn't expect closure. They expected endurance. Work identity further narrowed selfhood. A man's occupation defined him socially and morally. A respectable job implied discipline and worth. Unemployment carried stigma. Even when uncontrollable, work was not just economic, it was moral. Pride in labor coexisted with exhaustion. Complaining was discouraged. Gratitude was expected. This created a quiet, internal conflict. People felt strained but blamed themselves for it. If something felt wrong, the assumption was personal failure. not structural pressure. Mental health language didn't exist in a helpful way. Melancholy was romanticized but not treated. Anxiety was normalized. Burnout had no name. People endured and called it character. Social success required constant calibration, adjusting tone, modifying behavior, suppressing impulses. Over time, this became habit, and habits shape identity. People forgot which parts of themselves were natural and which were trained. That distinction blurred. Yet within these constraints, individuality still existed. It just expressed itself subtly in preferences, in private routines, in trusted relationships, in the way someone arranged their desk or chose their books. Small choices carried meaning. Tiny rebellions went unnoticed. And that was the point. To survive socially, selfhood had to be quiet, contained, unthreatening. People learned to take pride in this mastery, in being composed, reliable, predictable. There was comfort in knowing what was expected, in knowing how to move through the world without incident. For many, this felt like stability, even peace. And yet, beneath it all, a low hum of dissatisfaction persisted, not loud enough to disrupt life, just present, a sense that something was missing, something unnamed. But naming it would have required risk, and risk was rarely worth it. So people adopted. They measured themselves by external approval, by invitations received, by reputations maintained, by the absence of scandal. A life well lived was one without embarrassment. That standard shaped generations. As the city continued to grow and the century moved forward, these identities remained remarkably durable. They bent slightly, adjusted, but did not break easily. Victorian social rules were effective because they were internalized. People enforced them on themselves and often on each other. So rest there for a moment. A society where identity was not discovered but curated, where selfhood was something to manage, not explore. And next, we'll gently bring our long evening toward its close by looking at how these rules began to soften, how the edges blurred, and how Victorian London slowly prepared itself, without quite realizing it, for a different way of living. We keep going gently, almost without noticing the movement. By the later 1850 seconds, Victorian social rules had not collapsed, but they had begun to loosen at the edges. Not openly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt by those paying attention. The rules were still there, still enforced, still powerful, but they were no longer unquestioned. Small shifts appeared in daily life, subtle changes in tone, in tolerance, in what people were willing to overlook. Nothing announced, nothing declared, just the quiet recalibration. Industrial growth continued to reshape London. The city moved faster than the old rules preferred. New neighborhoods formed. New professions emerged. New kinds of people entered public life. Not everyone fit neatly into the existing categories. And rather than exclude everyone unfamiliar, society adjusted slightly, just enough to function. Social mobility, while limited, became more visible. People rose through business rather than inheritance. Their manners were sometimes imperfect, their accents slightly off, but their money spoke clearly. Respectability learned to compromise, not happily, but pragmatically. Etiquette adapted to necessity. Behavior guides updated, advice columns expanded, rules were clarified, revised, softened, still restrictive, just less brittle. Women, in particular, felt these shifts. Education opportunities widened modestly. Reading circles grew. Ideas circulated more freely. Not radical ideas, just different ones. The concept of fulfillment began to flicker faintly, not as a demand, as a possibility, still risky, still controlled, but present. Marriage expectations changed subtly. Companionship gained value alongside duty, not replacing it, just sharing space. Some marriages grew warmer, others remained formal, but the idea that emotional connection mattered gained quiet traction. Public behavior followed suit. Conversation became slightly more expressive, still polite, still careful, but less rigid. People allowed themselves a touch more personality, a bit more humor, a little less stiffness. Not much, just enough to breathe. Clothing reflected this gradual ease. The styles evolved, still structured, still layered, but increasingly decorative. Fashion permitted individuality within limits, a color choice, a fabric preference, tiny statements, personal but safe. Leisure expanded as well. Entertainment options grew, music halls, public lectures, organized outings, still regulated, still class coded, but more varied. Life felt slightly fuller, less confined to the home and church. Mental fatigue remained, but awareness grew. Melancholy was still common, anxiety still unnamed, but people began to recognize that constant restraint had costs, not publicly, privately, in letters, in diaries, in moments of quiet honesty. Social criticism emerged carefully. Writers hinted rather than accused. Observers noted rather than condemned. The system was questioned without being challenged. That distinction mattered. Victorian society did not respond well to confrontation, but it could absorb suggestion. Time itself softened behavior. Repetition breeds adaptation. What once felt rigid became routine. Routine became background. And background rules lose some of their sharpness. People still cared deeply about reputation, but fear eased slightly. A minor misstep was not always catastrophic. Forgiveness entered quietly, selective, uneven, but real. Generational differences widened. Younger Victorians inherited the rules but felt less reverence for them. They followed etiquette without the same intensity, respecting it but not worshiping it. They noticed inconsistencies, hypocrisy. They didn't always challenge it, but they saw it. And seeing is the first step toward change. Public morality remained strong, but less absolute. Scandals still shocked, but outrage faded faster. Society learned to move on. Adaptation became survival. Religion, too, adjusted. Faith remained central, but interpretation widened. Personal belief gained slightly more importance than public performance. Not enough to disrupt norms, enough to ease pressure. These shifts did not liberate everyone equally. Class boundaries remained firm, gender expectations persisted, but the atmosphere changed. Heaviness lifted a fraction, enough to notice if you'd lived under it long enough. By the end of the day, Victorian London still functioned on politeness, restraint, and observation, but the intensity had softened. People still performed respectability. They just believed in it a little less, and that made all the difference. This quiet evolution prepared society for future changes, not revolutions, adjustments, gradual redefinitions. Victorian social rules did not disappear. They transformed, they left traces, They shaped habits long after their strictest forms faded. Even as the century moved forward, their influence lingered in expectations, in manners, in discomfort with excess. The legacy of restraint endured. So, as we gently close the stretch of the night, let that settle. A society that built itself on control, learned to live inside it, and eventually began, almost without noticing, to loosen its grip. Not because it wanted to, because it had to. And in that slow, quiet shift, Victorian London took its first small steps toward a different way of being. We keep moving slowly, almost lazily now, as though the city itself is getting tired. By this point in the evening, Victorian London feels familiar, predictable, heavy but steady. The rules haven't vanished. They rarely do. They've simply become part of the furniture, unremarkable, always there, no longer questioned, just navigated. And that's how most eras actually end. Not with announcements, not with conclusions, just with people slowly behaving a little differently while insisting nothing has changed. In the late 1850s, daily life still looked unmistakably Victorian. Clothes were still structured, conversations still careful, reputations still guarded. But the emotional temperature had shifted, not warmed, just less cold. People allowed themselves small mercies, a slightly sharper joke, a less rigid schedule, a pause before correcting someone, tiny choices that would have felt dangerous a generation earlier. Etiquette manuals continued to sell well, which tells you everything you need to know. People still wanted guidance, still feared mistakes, still believed there was a right way to exist. But the tone of these guides changed. Less command, more suggestion, less threat of social ruin, more reassurance. You could sense the anxiety underneath. If the rules needed explaining so carefully, perhaps they were no longer self evident. Public life reflected this ambiguity. Formal events continued, but attendance became less rigid. Declining an invitation no longer required elaborate excuses. Absence wasn't always interpreted as insult. Sometimes it was just absence, an extraordinary concept. The pressure to be constantly visible eased slightly. Privacy gained a sliver of respect. Not much, just enough to matter. Domestic life continued to be idealized. The home was still framed as a moral haven, but the expectations softened. Perfection became less attainable, which paradoxically made it less required. Households could be imperfect without signaling failure. This was not universal, but it was spreading slowly, unevenly. Children, especially, felt these changes first. Parenting advice shifted tone, still strict, still moralizing, but slightly more attentive to emotional development. Affection became more acceptable, praise less dangerous, not indulgent, just human. These children would grow into adults with a different relationship to restraint, still cautious, still shaped by rules, but less convinced those rules were absolute. Work culture adapted as well. The rigid moral framing of labor began to loosen. Productivity still mattered, discipline still praised, but exhaustion was acknowledged more openly. Rest was no longer purely indulgent. It was sometimes necessary, a subtle but meaningful shift. Social observation remained constant. People still watched each other, still judged, still whispered, but the consequences softened. Reputation was still important, but no longer entirely unforgiving. Recovery became possible. Redemption entered the social vocabulary. quietly, uneasily, but present. This mattered deeply because fear loses power when mistakes are survivable. Religion reflected this evolution. Moral instruction persisted, but tone softened. Faith became slightly more personal, less performative. Not enough to dismantle expectations, but enough to relieve pressure. Sermons shifted emphasis. Less fire, more guidance. Still morale, just gentler. The city itself changed. London grew louder, faster, more complex. Gas lamps brightened streets. Transportation improved. Distance shrank. Exposure increased. It became harder to pretend the world was static and harder still to maintain total control. This constant movement reshaped social awareness. People encountered difference more often, different accents, different habits, different values. Avoidance became impractical. Tolerance, while reluctant, became useful. Victorian etiquette responded pragmatically. It adjusted. It always did. That adaptability was its strength. Rules bent to preserve the system rather than break it. This is why Victorian social norms lasted as long as they did. They evolved just enough to remain relevant. Even so, something essential shifted. The belief that restraint alone guaranteed virtue weakened. People began to suspect that goodness might require more than compliance. This suspicion was rarely spoken aloud, but it lingered, an idea waiting patiently. For many individuals, this translated into quiet reevaluation. They did not abandon manners, they refined them. They used etiquette as a tool rather than a cage. Politeness became strategic, selective, intentional. People learned when to follow the rules strictly and when to relax them safely. This discernment marked a new kind of social intelligence, less rigid, more adaptive. The emotional landscape changed accordingly. People still suppressed feelings, but they recognized them more clearly. Loneliness, dissatisfaction, restlessness. These were no longer moral failures. They were experiences, uncomfortable ones, but shared. This recognition reduced isolation, not dramatically, just enough. Friendships deepened slightly. Marriages became more emotionally complex, still constrained, still structured, but warmer, sometimes, not always, enough to notice. Victorian society never fully abandoned its core values. Respectability remained central. Self control remained prized. Discretion remained essential. But the rigidity softened into something more livable. The rules stayed, but the edges dulled. And dulled edges cut less deeply. As the century continued, these softened norms would lay groundwork for further change. Not sudden, not revolutionary, incremental. That was the Victorian way. Progress through endurance, change through adjustment, nothing loud, nothing messy, just a long series of quiet recalibrations. And that's perhaps the most Victorian thing of all. A society that rarely admitted it was changing, even as it did so constantly. So, as we rest here at the end of this long drift through etiquette and expectation, take a moment to appreciate the strange balance Victorians maintained between order and fatigue, between restraint and desire, between performance and selfhood. They lived inside their rules so completely that the rules became invisible. And when they finally began to loosen them, they did so without fanfare, just a collective exhale, barely audible, enough to keep going. And that's where we'll leave Victorian London for tonight. Not finished, not resolved, just continuing, as it always did, We'll keep going, just a little longer, still slow, still even, as if the night itself isn't in any hurry. By now, Victorian London feels less like a place and more like a habit, something learned, something repeated, something passed down without anyone quite remembering why. Because that's how social rules really survive. Not through enforcement, through inheritance. By the late 1850s, many Victorians were no longer consciously thinking about etiquette at all. They were simply living it. The pauses in conversation, the careful wording, the instinct to apologize for existing, all of it felt natural. And that naturalness was the system's greatest success. Children absorbed these behaviors effortlessly. They watched adults navigate rooms, listened to tones shift, noticed when smiles tightened. They learned which questions caused discomfort, which topics ended conversations, which emotions were inconvenient. No one needed to explain it. Correction came through silence, through redirection, through that subtle sense of having gone slightly wrong. And so the rules continued not as laws, as instincts. This is how Victorian social norms extended far beyond their own century. They lingered in posture, in politeness, in discomfort with excess emotion, in the idea that composure equals character. Even when the world changed, those habits stayed close. They were portable. Victorians carried them into new eras without noticing. Industrial progress accelerated, technology advanced, cities expanded, but manners moved at a slower pace. They always do, because manners are about fear, fear of judgment, fear of exclusion, fear of standing out. And those fears age very well. Public spaces continued to demand performance. Even as crowds grew larger, individuals learned to shrink themselves socially. Politeness became a shield, a way to move through complexity without friction, still useful, still valued, still quietly exhausting. Workplaces inherited these norms directly. Professionalism became the new respectability. Emotional neutrality became competence. Personal life was separated from public function, not because it was healthier, because it was manageable. The Victorian instinct to compartmentalize survived intact. Social success still depended on reading unspoken rules, understanding tone, knowing when to speak, knowing when not to. These skills remained essential. They were just reframed, no longer morale. Now, practical, the moral language softened, but the behavior stayed. Domestic life also retained Victorian echoes. The idea of the home as a refuge persisted. So did the pressure to make it orderly, calm, presentable, a reflection of worth. Perfection was no longer expected, but effort was, you were still judged, just more gently. Sometimes gender roles shifted over time, but not evenly. Women gained opportunities, men gained flexibility, but expectation lingered. Emotional labor remained invisible. Restraint remained admirable. Independence was encouraged, but only to a point. The Victorian compromise lived on. Be yourself, but not too much. Even leisure inherited these habits. Relaxation came with guilt. Rest needed justification. Idleness still felt wrong. The idea that worth must be earned never fully disappeared. Victorian productivity ethics embedded themselves deeply. People learned to equate busyness with value, a difficult belief to unlearn. Mental health awareness improved slowly. Language developed, understanding expanded, but the instinct to endure quietly persisted. Many still struggled to admit vulnerability, to ask for help, to be openly unwell. Victorian Stoicism had long legs. Social interaction retained its careful choreography. Even in more relaxed eras, people worried about saying the wrong thing, about oversharing, about being inappropriate. These anxieties are not modern inventions. They are inheritances, polished and repackaged. Etiquette books faded, but advice columns replaced them. Guides changed format, not purpose. People still wanted reassurance, still feared social mistakes, still believed there was a correct way to exist. The medium evolved, the anxiety remained. What Victorians perfected was not repression, but adaptation. They learned to live with dissatisfaction without naming it, to function without fulfillment, to prioritize stability over joy. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. In a rapidly changing world, restraint felt safe, and safety, once established, is hard to abandon. Yet, even within this legacy, something softened. Over generations, the sharpest edges wore down. Affection became easier, expression less dangerous. Authenticity cautiously valued, not without resistance, not without backlash. But gradually, Victorian society did not vanish. It diffused. It dissolved into daily habits so subtle they became invisible. We still apologize reflexively, still moderate emotion in public, still judge ourselves harshly for discomfort, still equate control with maturity. These instincts feel personal. They rarely are. They are historical, learned, passed quietly from one generation to the next. And that's perhaps the most fascinating thing about Victorian social rules. Not how strict they were, but how durable, how gently they embedded themselves into everyday life, how they taught people to live inside limits without calling them limits. By the time anyone thought to question them seriously, they felt like common sense. That's power, not loud power, not forceful power, soft power, the kind that shapes behavior without resistance. As we slowly bring this long, quiet evening to rest, imagine Victorian London settling into sleep, gas lamps dimming, streets emptying, homes closing in on themselves, people lying awake, not unhappy, not content, just existing within expectations, thinking private thoughts they would never say aloud, planning tomorrow's performance, adjusting themselves in advance, and then eventually drifting off. That rhythm repeated millions of times, enough to shape a culture, enough to leave echoes that still surround us. Victorian social rules were never just about forks and calling cards. They were about fear, control, belonging, and the deep human desire not to be excluded. Those désirs don't disappear, they just find new expressions. So if any of this feels familiar, that's not an accident. You're hearing the long echo of a society that mastered the art of quiet endurance. And with that thought, we can finally let Victorian London fade into the background. Not gone, just resting, like all the habits we never quite unlearn. Legacy, routine, and the subtle persistence of the Victorian mindset. We continue gently flowing, as though each word is a step along a quiet street in London. By now, the night has settled fully. The city's gas lamps have flickered low. The air is thick with smoke, soot, and expectation. The people of Victorian London have long since gone to bed, but their routines, their habits, their very instincts linger like shadows. And this is the part to consider most carefully. Those routines did not vanish with the century. They became invisible frameworks, quietly shaping lives for generations to come. The first legacy is temporal. Victorians structured every moment with precision. Rise, breakfast, work, calls, social visits, dinner, evening, entertainment, sleep. Every day had its rhythm, every hour its expectation. Even as clocks modernized and schedules accelerated, people retained this deep sense of temple discipline. Time remained segmented, purposeful, moralized. Wasting a day still carries guilt. Productivity still equates with value. The Industrial Revolution only amplified this awareness, teaching future generations to live by schedules as if moral virtue depended on them. Hours, minutes, and punctuality became enduring habits. They are, in a way, a Victorian inheritance of the mind. The second legacy is emotional. Suppression was drilled into daily life. Control over feelings, avoidance of excess, quiet endurance. These were survival skills. Over time, they became instincts. Even today, people apologize reflexively. They moderate excitement. They endure small suffering silently. These are not modern inventions. They are echoes of the Victorian ethic that composure equals virtue. Emotional restraint is practical, learned, habitual, internalized, and quietly persistent. The third legacy is spatial and behavioral. Victorian rules were often about presence, how to sit, where to stand, when to speak, how close to approach, personal space, gestures, posture, tone of voice, eye contact, all codified. And while most of those codifications have faded in explicit form, the subtler lessons remain. People still sense discomfort in others' proximity. Social observation continues. Adjusting behavior based on unseen rules is second nature. The city streets may be more forgiving, the houses less formal, the tables less rigid, but human instinct still anticipates judgment. Politeness functions as a survival tool, a mechanism learned centuries ago and carried forward unconsciously. The fourth legacy is moral perception. Victorians believed virtue could be demonstrated through action and appearance. Public conduct mattered more than private thought. Today, the principle has shifted, but vestiges remain. People still judge through observation. Appearances still influence assumptions. Effort is still valued alongside outcome. Reputation, while less codified, remains a social currency. Subtle echoes of moral performance still shape careers, social circles, and behavior. The idea that living correctly is more about perception than experience has roots deep in the Victorian consciousness. The fifth legacy is relational. Courtship, marriage, friendship, all framed by observation, hierarchy, and caution. While modern relationships allow greater spontaneity and emotional expression, there's still inherited vigilance. First impressions matter, public behavior is monitored, socially visible mistakes are corrected. We learn, like our Victorian forebears, to moderate ourselves for acceptance. We navigate networks with awareness, careful about tone, volume, and gesture. We inherit a cultural caution in connecting, a patience for observation, a reflex for subtlety. It is quiet, pervasive, and surprisingly durable. The city itself also bears the marks. London, once compact and rule bound, has grown chaotic, sprawling, technologically advanced. Yet the cultural DNA, established in the 1850 seconds, informs infrastructure, social norms, and etiquette. Sidewalk behavior, commuting patience, the formality of professional interaction, all of these echo Victorian habits. The city grew, but the mental map remained. That persistence is remarkable. Behavior learned in drawing rooms, parlors, and streets continues to shape responses, even unconsciously. The persistence is partly psychological. Humans are conservative with their habits. Behaviors practiced consistently over decades become automatic. Victorian society practiced its social rules for a generation, embedding them deeply. They became reflexive, not just learned. The repetition created neural patterns, cultural heuristics. People did not consciously follow every rule. They absorbed the logic of the system and applied it instinctively. Politeness, restraint, rhythm, attention to hierarchy, and endurance all became cognitive habits, passed down subtly through observation, imitation, and social expectation. This explains why, even after strict Victorian norms faded in overt practice, the mindset endures. We continue to measure ourselves against unseen expectations. We calculate appropriateness. We regulate emotion. We endure quietly. These behaviors are not merely cultural, they are inherited strategies for navigating social space. They are the residue of a society that mastered the art of living inside rules without needing to name them, a society that built resilience, discretion, and subtle observation into the fabric of daily life. The final legacy is subtlety itself. Victorian society valued understatement, not revealing too much, not demanding attention, not challenging norms overtly. This principle persists in modern social behavior. We downplay enthusiasm, we moderate criticism, we hedge opinions, we perform diplomacy constantly. It is less about fear now and more about convenience, habit, and tact. But the structural similarity to Victorian restraint is clear. Politeness as survival has shifted into politeness as strategy. Subtlety has become a hallmark of enduring social interaction, quietly inherited from a century of learned restraint. Thus, as we pause and breathe, consider the long shadow of 1850 seconds London, a city alive with rules, restraint, observation, and endurance. A society that shaped time, space, emotion, morality, and relationships so thoroughly that the human mind itself internalized the lessons. These lessons persisted long after gas lamps dimmed and corsets loosened. They persisted in behavior, in expectation, in habit, and in quiet self monitoring. They are not visible in textbooks. They are lived in everyday gestures, thoughts, and silences. They are felt in interactions, observed in cities, and quietly measured in moments of reflection. They are the faint hum of the Victorian mind, enduring and unspoken. As we conclude this long drift, allow yourself to imagine the quiet persistence of these lessons. The streets, the homes, the parlors, the offices, the social gatherings, all shaping behavior without overt instruction. The hum of endurance, restraint, and observation continues. It shapes the present, informed by the past. People move through space cautiously, speak measuredly, moderate their feelings, endure quietly, and judge discreetly. And in doing so, they carry forward the essence of a society that thrived on invisibility, control, and subtlety. That essence, like the faint light of a gas lamp on a foggy street, still lingers, soft, persistent, guiding without force. And so the Victorian rules live on not as law, not as command, but as habit, instinct, and quiet shadow. Reflection, habit, and the gentle weight of the Victorian legacy. We continue slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though we are wandering through the streets of 1850 seconds London after midnight, gas lamps glowing faintly and smoke lingering in the corners. By this stage, it is clear that Victorian social rules were not simply instructions. They were frameworks for thought, for feeling, for being. They occupied the mind as much as they occupied the body. Everyday life was choreographed not by law alone, but by habit, by observation, by the internalization of countless small imperatives that told people who they were allowed to be. And that internalization is the core of their enduring legacy. The first aspect of reflection is awareness. Victorians cultivated a constant, quiet self consciousness, not the loud, anxious self consciousness of panic, but a subtle, persistent monitoring. Every gesture, word, and glance carried meaning. People learned to anticipate judgment. They learned to weigh consequences before action. This awareness became habitual. Once internalized, it was rarely abandoned. It shaped decisions large and small: what to wear, whom to greet, how long to converse, how loudly to laugh, how much space to occupy. The mind itself became a stage, the body an instrument, and the audience invisible but ever present. The second aspect is routine. Routine under Victorian rules was more than habit, it was survival. Days were divided into discrete segments. Activities had purpose, times, and sequences. Sleep, meals, work, leisure, family visits, evening calls all followed predictable patterns. This repetition trained the mind to expect order and continuity. Even after the strictest norms faded, the instinct to structure daily life remained. Modern schedules, punctuality, and productivity obsessions are echoes of these rhythms. The past did not vanish. It was encoded in behavior, layered beneath conscious thought, quietly persistent and often unexamined. The third aspect is endurance. Emotional endurance was central. Restraint over feeling was learned, practiced, and praised. Disappointment, frustration, loneliness, and anxiety were endured quietly. Public acknowledgement was rare, private articulation rarefied. This endurance became a strategy. It was taught to children, reinforced in social interactions, and rewarded subtly over a lifetime. Even in contemporary life, the impulse to endure discomfort silently, to prioritize composure, is a legacy of these Victorian expectations. Endurance was not only survival, it was a moral and social currency, a badge of legitimacy passed down invisibly through generations. The fourth aspect is observation. Victorians were trained to observe constantly. The social environment was a mirror. The behavior of others was data. Every misstep, hesitation, or misjudged gesture taught lessons. People internalized these lessons as guidance for their own conduct. Observation shaped identity. It shaped social interaction. It even shaped emotional life, as people learned to modulate feelings based on expected reception. This reflexive observation persists. Modern social anxiety, politeness, and self monitoring are faint continuations of the same skill, learned over centuries and remarkably enduring. The fifth aspect is subtlety. Perhaps the most enduring Victorian trait was the cultivation of subtlety. Speech was measured, emotion was controlled, criticism and humor were veiled, expression was indirect. Subtlety became a survival skill and a social art. And subtlety remains a hallmark of social navigation. We hedge statements, moderate reactions, gauge audience reception, and adjust behaviors instinctively. The Victorian emphasis on restraint, observation, and layered communication created a cultural intelligence that persists, largely unrecognized, in modern life. The structural legacies were equally persistent. Class distinctions, while transformed, influenced behavior for decades. Gender expectations remained encoded in speech, posture, and conduct. Family roles continued to carry implicit moral weight. Public spaces retained echoes of regulated behavior, maintaining composure on a crowded train, moderating conversation volume, navigating social visibility. Physical and social spaces carried invisible rules learned long ago, still enacted automatically, often unconsciously. The city itself, in its architecture, layout, and public decorum, preserved fragments of Victorian logic that continue to shape daily life and perception. The moral legacy, too, is subtle yet profound. Virtue was demonstrated more in performance than in internal conviction. The idea that appearances matter more than truths persists. People continue to adjust behavior to maintain social legitimacy. Reputation remains a subtle regulator of action. Public perception continues to guide private conduct. Effort, moderation, and composure are quietly celebrated, inherited from a century when these traits determined social survival. This moral coding, embedded in culture, continues to influence interaction, perception, and judgment long after the gas lamps have gone out. The psychological imprint of Victorian habits is also striking. Habits learned over decades become instinctive, shaping cognition as well as action. People internalize restraint, endurance, observation, and timing as automatic responses. Emotional regulation becomes instinctive. Attention to hierarchy, context, and decorum is often unconscious. Behavior is filtered through lenses established centuries earlier. Even when individuals believe they act freely, they carry the weight of these inherited norms. The past persists in the nervous system, the body, and the mind, quietly guiding thought and interaction. The generational aspect is crucial. Children absorbed rules by observing adults, by imitating gestures, by noting consequences of minor missteps. Correction often came through silence, absence, or subtle redirection. Habits were reinforced, expectations encoded, and behaviors normalized without explicit instruction. These patterns, once internalized, were remarkably resilient. The process was slow, almost invisible, yet profoundly effective. Modern anxieties about propriety, the instinct to moderate emotion, the reflex to maintain composure, and the careful navigation of social environments are all distant echoes of this process. The final element is endurance in ambiguity. Victorian rules were never fully codified for every circumstance. People learned to adapt, improvise, and navigate gray areas. The ability to function within ambiguity became a skill, and it persists today. Modern social fluidity, the negotiation of norms, the balancing of private desires and public expectations all draw on the cognitive and cultural training inherited from Victorian precedent. The world may have changed, but the strategies remain quietly operative. Reflecting on all this, one realizes that the Victorian legacy is less about visible artifacts, corsets, manners, hats, and more about invisible architecture. Time, attention, emotion, observation, restraint, and social calibration are all structural. They form the scaffolding of human behavior long after outward appearances have shifted. They endure because they are internalized, practiced, repeated, and observed. They shape daily life, identity, and perception in ways that are subtle but persistent. The past becomes habit becomes instinct, and instinct becomes the foundation for future conduct. As we drift to the close of this long meditation, imagine the quiet persistence of these invisible rules. People moving through streets, offices, homes, and gatherings, behaving with the inherited knowledge of how to be seen, how to endure, how to survive socially. The rhythm continues: observation, adjustment, restraint, endurance. A society that taught itself to live inside limits without naming them has left a soft but enduring trace. And in that trace, we recognize the faint, persistent hum of Victorian London, guiding gestures, thoughts, and emotions, quietly shaping behavior long after its era ended. It is subtle, pervasive, and almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once you know to look. And so the night of reflection settles, carrying with it the understanding that history is never truly gone. It continues in habits, instincts, and quiet routines, a gentle shadow guiding the living through streets both familiar and unknowable. Continuity, adaptation, and the quiet strength of Victorian influence. We continue slowly, letting the narrative drift as though through the foggy streets of London in the late evening, the city breathing quietly around us. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were more than a temporary phenomenon. They were enduring frameworks that shaped thought, behavior, and expectation across generations. They persisted not through coercion but through habitual internalization. They became invisible scaffolding supporting everyday life, quietly organizing time, space, emotion, and interaction. Their influence did not vanish with the end of the century. It adapted, softened, and continued, often unnoticed but powerful nonetheless. The first element of continuity is habit. Victorians practiced restraint, observation, and composure repeatedly across decades and contexts. Habit, once established, becomes instinctive. The daily routines, structured meals, regulated work, timed visits, controlled social calls trained minds and bodies alike. Even when strict schedules loosened, the instinct for order remained. Modern punctuality, attention to preparation, and structured professional and social interaction are echoes of this temporal discipline. People act as though their behavior is autonomous, yet much is inherited habit, passed down through observation and repetition. Habit overlaps with endurance. Emotional endurance was central to Victorian life. People learned to suppress disappointment, anxiety, and frustration, to manage desire and longing quietly, and to maintain composure in public. Endurance became moralized. It was praised, observed, and rewarded subtly. Generations inherited this skill unconsciously. Today, endurance remains a valued trait, often mistaken for personal strength alone, yet deeply rooted in historical social training. Stoicism, quiet perseverance, and emotional restraint continue to shape behavior, sometimes without awareness. The third element is social observation. Victorian citizens monitored themselves and others constantly. Supple, ques gestures, posture, tone, expression carried meaning. The ability to read these cues, anticipate judgment, and adjust behavior accordingly became a social skill as vital as walking or speaking. This skill has persisted. Modern humans continue to navigate subtle social hierarchies, adjusting tone, managing appearance, and predicting reactions. These reflexive behaviors are part of a long continuum, a legacy of centuries of learned social vigilance. Subtlety itself was perhaps the most enduring Victorian trait. Speech was measured, emotion controlled, criticism veiled, humor understated. Social negotiation required indirectness and careful calculation. Even in contemporary settings, subtlety remains valuable. People moderate expression, hedge opinions, and observe silent boundaries, often unconsciously. Victorian social logic did not disappear. It evolved into a more flexible, yet still perceptible, framework for interacting safely and effectively within complex social spaces. The fourth element is morality as performance. In Victorian London, virtue was demonstrated more in conduct than internal belief. Reputation mattered more than private feelings. Appearance guided judgment. These principles, though less rigid today, persist subtly. People continue to manage impressions carefully, valuing perception alongside reality. Effort, restraint, and composure remain metrics of social approval, echoing the deeply embedded Victorian logic that public behavior communicates character. Moral performance became a template for navigating broader social contexts, and its legacy continues in contemporary concern for reputation and presentation. The fifth element is identity shaped by limitation. Victorian society trained individuals to exist within boundaries. Class, gender, occupation, and family roles provided frameworks that guided conduct. Personal expression was often restricted, emotional visibility controlled. Yet these constraints taught individuals skills, discretion, self awareness, strategic communication. Modern self regulation, social tact, and emotional moderation are partially inherited extensions of this framework. The rules may have softened, but the practice of negotiating boundaries remains central to human interaction, a subtle inheritance of Victorian social engineering. The urban environment itself carries lessons. London's streets, parlor rooms, offices, and transport systems once demanded precision, attention, and performance. People learned to move through these spaces with awareness, anticipating consequences, adjusting behavior, and maintaining composure. These spatial lessons survived infrastructural and cultural changes. The cognitive patterns established by moving through Victorian spaces, attention to detail, timing, posture, and social awareness remain embedded in urban behavior today. Cities may grow, architecture may change, but behavioral imprint persists. The psychological impact is profound. Repetition over decades converted social rules into reflex. Self monitoring, emotional restraint, careful observation, and subtle judgment became ingrained. People internalized constraints as instinct. Modern anxieties, politeness, endurance, and strategic moderation often reflect this deep rooted training. Individuals act without conscious thought, guided by structures learned long ago, a testament to the enduring cognitive power of socialization practices from a previous century. Continuity is reinforced generationally. Children absorb norms through observation, imitation, and subtle correction. Adults rarely needed to explain rules explicitly. Their behavior modeled them. Silence, absence, gentle redirection, and example became teachers. Habits, expectations, and social intuitions were passed down, creating resilient patterns that survived social change. Even as norms relaxed, the mechanisms of transmission ensured persistence. Legacy was encoded in behavior before it was consciously understood. The Victorian approach to ambiguity contributed to the durability of their influence. Social rules were not exhaustive. People learned to improvise, adapt, and navigate gray areas. These strategies became cognitive templates. Modern problem solving, negotiation, and strategic social interaction inherit this adaptability. The ability to function within uncertain boundaries, to manage subtle rules without overt instruction, remains a hallmark of social competence rooted in Victorian experience. Reflecting on all this, the endurance of Victorian influence is striking. Time, observation, restraint, endurance, subtlety, and internalized moral logic have persisted quietly across centuries. Modern life continues to be shaped by these invisible scaffolds. Daily routines, social interaction, emotional modulation, and even private thought are subtly guided by practices inherited from a society that valued composure, observation, and cautious performance above all else. The legacy is pervasive yet almost invisible, a quiet architecture of human behavior. Finally, as we allow this long, reflective drift to settle, imagine the persistent hum of 1,850 seconds London. People moving through rooms, streets, workplaces, and homes, calibrated by inherited expectations, behaving, enduring, observing, adjusting, a society that mastered living within invisible boundaries without naming them, a society that taught patience, discretion, and subtlety, and a society whose lessons echo softly through generations. This is the quiet, persistent Victorian mind, alive in habits, instincts, and daily life. It is enduring, pervasive, and subtle, guiding the living without command, shaping behavior with gentle, invisible persistence, and leaving a shadow that lingers long after the gas lamps have gone out. The invisible framework, everyday discipline, and the lingering rhythm of Victorian life. We continue slowly as they're walking through the quiet streets of London just before dawn, fog curling around gas lamps, and the city holding its breath. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were not merely external expectations. They became an invisible framework embedded deeply in thought, behavior, and perception. People did not simply follow the rules, they internalized them, lived them unconsciously, and transmitted them through habit, observation, and repetition. The influence of this internalization persisted far beyond the strictest era of 1,850 seconds London, shaping daily life in subtle but enduring ways. The first aspect of this invisible framework is attention to detail. Victorians honed a constant awareness of context, gesture, and appearance. Clothing had to be correct, posture proper, conversation measured. Even small errors could carry social meaning. Over time, these behaviors became ingrained. Modern descendants of these habits persist in professional etiquette, social awareness, and self presentation. We monitor ourselves automatically in public spaces, adjusting tone, gesture, and expression, often without conscious thought. This skill, learned through centuries of subtle social pressure, remains powerful precisely because it is invisible and habitual. The second aspect is temporal discipline. Daily life in Victorian London was regimented. Meals, work, leisure, and social calls were all timed. This structuring of the day instilled an instinctual respect for routine, order, and schedule. The cognitive imprint of this temporal awareness survives. Even as work schedules evolved and leisure became more flexible, humans maintain an internalized sense of punctuality, planning, and time management. Our perception of efficiency and the moral value of time is a quiet echo of Victorian rigor and structure. The third aspect is emotional calibration. Victorians valued control over feeling, public composure, emotional restraint, and endurance of discomfort were praised and internalized. This training shaped emotional reflexes. Even in contemporary life, people moderate expression, manage visible frustration, and endure anxiety quietly. Polite laughter, measured response, and careful tone are direct descendants of the Victorian insistence on subtlety. Emotional regulation became a practical skill and a moral expectation, a legacy encoded in habit rather than explicit instruction. The fourth aspect is social observation. Victorians constantly monitored themselves and others. A glance, a posture, a hesitation carried information. Learning to read these cues was essential for navigating daily life. This skill persists as social intuition, the unconscious ability to gauge reactions, anticipate disapproval, and moderate behavior. Observation shaped identity. It taught individuals which behaviors were permissible, which were risky, and which ensured belonging. Modern social navigation is informed by the same cognitive structures, even when the original rules have faded. The fifth aspect is subtlety as strategy. Direct confrontation was avoided, indirect communication was prized. Humor, criticism, and negotiation were veiled. Learning to communicate subtly became essential. Modern interactions still depend on nuance, implication, and discretion. We hedge opinions, moderate expression, and negotiate expectations with quiet care. This inherited subtlety allows humans to function socially without overt conflict and demonstrates the enduring power of Victorian social training. The sixth aspect is relational caution. Courtship, marriage, family dynamics, and friendships were navigated through careful observation, hierarchy, and moderation. Emotional exposure was limited, and affection was mediated by social expectation. These strategies trained generations to evaluate interactions carefully, calibrate responses, and maintain discretion. Even today, humans instinctively moderate relationships, manage impressions, and balance vulnerability with social safety, demonstrating the cognitive legacy of these practices. The seventh aspect is the integration of rules into identity. By adulthood, Victorians did not consciously follow every regulation. They were internalized as instinct. Time management, politeness, restraint, and subtle judgment became part of the self. Modern humans still exhibit these habits, often unaware of their historical origin. Identity was not merely constructed socially, it was structured cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally, a product of long term reinforcement of Victorian norms. The eighth aspect is endurance in ambiguity. Victorian rules were rarely comprehensive. People learned to navigate gray areas, improvise, and adapt without explicit guidance. This skill became an enduring cognitive template. Today, negotiation, diplomacy, and strategic social interaction inherit this adaptability. The ability to function within uncertainty, to manage nuanced boundaries, and to anticipate social response is a quiet continuation of Victorian social intelligence. The ninth aspect is the moral architecture of daily life. Virtue was demonstrated through conduct and perception. Effort, restraint, and composure were markers of social approval. This framework persists subtly. Modern individuals continue to adjust behavior to maintain social legitimacy. Reputation, appearances, and controlled self expression remain crucial social tools. Moral performance, though less codified, still influences daily decisions, communication, and social alignment. The tenth aspect is the persistence of domestic and urban habits. Homes were structured, orderly, and morally framed. Streets and public spaces demanded awareness and adjustment. These spatial and environmental habits persisted, influencing posture, movement, attention, and timing. Cognitive patterns established in Victorian spaces remain in contemporary urban behavior, guiding interaction and self monitoring, even as infrastructure and social norms have evolved. Reflecting on all these aspects, the enduring strength of Victorian influence becomes evident. The invisible framework shapes daily life, identity, emotional regulation, social observation, subtlety, relational management, moral perception, and cognitive adaptation. It persists not through coercion but through internalization, repetition, and observation, quietly guiding behavior. Its rhythms and habits remain embedded in the minds and actions of modern humans, shaping interaction, endurance, and perception long after the original social structures faded. As we conclude this reflection, imagine the soft, persistent hum of 1,850 seconds London continuing into modern life. Individuals moving carefully through space, moderating behavior, enduring quietly, observing constantly, communicating subtly, and navigating complex social environments with inherited strategies. This is the quiet persistence of Victorian social rules, not visible, not enforced, but alive in habit, instinct, and the subtle architecture of human conduct, a legacy that continues to shape lives across time, soft, pervasive, and unbroken. Enduring rhythm, quiet control, and the subtle pulse of Victorian habits. We continue, gently, letting the narrative drift like fog over the Thames at dawn, slow, rhythmic, unbroken. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were never merely instructions. They became internalized rhythms, cognitive patterns, and emotional templates, shaping not only behavior but perception, self awareness, and the subtle management of others. They functioned as invisible architecture, guiding daily life through routine, observation, and calibrated restraint. Even when outward appearances of strict Victorian etiquette faded, the internalized habits endured, adapting to changing times but remaining fundamentally intact. They persisted in the gestures, thoughts, and social navigation of generations who never knew the era that created them. The first pulse is self regulation. Victorians trained themselves to manage every outward signal: posture, tone, eye contact, speech, movement. Public composure was a moral expectation, internalized as instinct. Over time, this control became reflexive. Modern individuals continue to manage their behavior unconsciously, whether in workplaces, social gatherings, or casual interactions. The subtle monitoring of self and the anticipatory adjustment of conduct are enduring Victorian legacies, invisible but pervasive, shaping thought and action long after corsets and crinolines disappeared. The second pulse is temporal discipline. Daily life was precisely segmented: meals, work, social visits, leisure, study, rest. People internalized schedules, punctuality, and the moral weight of using time wisely. Today, the emphasis on planning, productivity, and efficient use of time echoes these norms. Habitually checking the clock, structuring the day, and maintaining routine are cognitive descendants of Victorian temporal rigor. Even as society became more flexible, the internalized rhythm of measured time persists, shaping work patterns, domestic life, and social engagement. The third pulse is endurance. Emotional restraint was central to Victorian life. Frustration, longing, and disappointment were endured quietly. Public acknowledgement was rare. This habit of enduring discomfort without complaint became a cultural and psychological inheritance. Modern humans continue to suppress minor irritations, moderate emotional display, and endure subtle social tensions, often unconsciously. This endurance is not mere self control, it is a behavioral legacy of a society that equated restraint with moral and social worth. The fourth pulse is observation. Victorians constantly monitored others, reading subtle cues and calibrating their own behavior accordingly. This skill of social perception became instinctive. Today, humans unconsciously gauge reactions, anticipate judgment, and moderate behavior in real time. The ability to navigate nuanced social environments, anticipate consequences, and adjust conduct subtly is directly descended from Victorian practices of observation and reflexive social intelligence. Observation overlaps with subtlety, the fifth pulse. Speech was indirect, criticism veiled, humor understated. Communicating without offense required constant calibration. These lessons in subtle negotiation persist. Modern politeness, hedging of opinions, measured expression, and strategic communication are echoes of this careful modulation. Subtlety is not only tactical, it is habitual, learned through repetition, observation, and the inherited cognitive frameworks of Victorian social logic. The sixth pulse is relational calibration. Courtship, marriage, family, and friendships were navigated through hierarchy, moderation, and careful observation. Emotional exposure was limited. Affection was mediated. These strategies trained generations to manage relationships cautiously, evaluate interactions, and balance vulnerability with social safety. Modern social behavior, careful management of impressions, and the instinct to moderate intimacy reflect this inherited relational logic. Identity and interaction were inseparable, shaped by rules that persisted invisibly across time. The seventh pulse is moral performance. Virtue was shown through conduct rather than private belief. Appearance and effort signaled character. Though explicit moral policing faded, the principle persists. Reputation and perception continued to guide behavior. We moderate actions, observe decorum, and perform subtle moral cues unconsciously. Effort, composure, and restraint remain valued traits, demonstrating the deep rooted influence of Victorian moral architecture on contemporary social life. The eighth pulse is domestic and spatial habit. Homes were orderly, routines structured, and public spaces navigated with awareness. Spatial cognition, attention to propriety, and the choreography of movement remain influenced by these practices. Modern posture, commuting behavior, personal space negotiation, and domestic organization carry the imprint of the Victorian emphasis on disciplined interaction with physical and social environments. The lessons learned in parlor, street, and office became cognitive templates, enduring across generations. The ninth pulse is the internalization of rules. By adulthood, Victorians rarely consciously referred to etiquette, they embodied it. Habits of time management, politeness, subtlety, endurance, and observation were reflexive. Modern individuals continue similar patterns, often unaware of their historical origin. Social intelligence, emotional regulation, and strategic behavior are shaped by these ingrained routines. The Victorian training in instinctive self monitoring and environmental adaptation persists as a quiet cognitive legacy. The 10th pulse is adaptability within constraint. Victorian rules were never exhaustive. People learned to improvise, to navigate ambiguity, to act strategically. This capacity for adaptation became an inherited skill, informing negotiation, problem solving, and complex social interaction. Modern humans continue to employ these strategies unconsciously, balancing constraint with creativity, public expectation with private desire, adaptability, subtle negotiation, and skillful navigation of gray areas remain enduring Victorian gifts. Finally, as we drift to the close of this long meditation, consider the totality of this influence. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, temporal discipline, relational calibration, moral performance, spatial awareness, internalized conduct, and adaptive skill all persist as the quiet pulse of Victorian London. They move through bodies, minds, and social spaces invisibly, structuring thought, guiding action, and moderating interaction. The city, society, and cognition remain shaped by these subtle but pervasive rhythms. The legacy is not visible in law, fashion, or instruction, but in the ongoing management of self and others, the careful calibration of behavior, and the reflexive endurance of social expectations. Victorian London, long faded from the material world, continues to live in habit, instinct, and subtle rhythm, quietly shaping lives, guiding conduct, and marking time with invisible precision. The persistent echo, silent structures, and the ever present influence of Victorian norms. We continue our slow drift, as though wandering the quiet, fog laden streets of London just before dawn, listening to the faint hum of the city and the invisible rhythms it has instilled. By now, it is evident that Victorian social rules were far more than a set of instructions or fashion protocols. They were internalized frameworks that shaped cognition, emotion, and interaction across lifetimes. These frameworks persisted in habits, gestures, thought patterns, and subtle social calibration, influencing generations long after corsets, crinolines, and rigid etiquette manuals vanished. They endured in the invisible architecture of behavior, quietly guiding actions, shaping perception, and structuring the rhythm of daily life. The first dimension of this persistent echo is habitual structure. Victorians lived by routines, so meticulously maintained that repetition became instinct. Daily schedules, work patterns, social visits, meals, and sleep were all regimented, reinforcing temporal awareness and discipline. Even as the strict routines relaxed over time, the mental architecture they produced remained. Modern humans continue to segment time, prioritize tasks, and measure efficiency, often without awareness of the historical roots of these habits. The daily rhythm of planning, execution, and reflection is a cognitive inheritance, quietly encoded through generations. The second dimension is the internalization of composure and emotional restraint. In Victorian society, outward emotional expression was carefully moderated. Feelings were measured, displayed selectively, and often suppressed. Over time, this practice became habitual, producing instinctive emotional regulation. Today, the careful calibration of expression, moderation of excitement, avoidance of public displays of frustration, and subtle endurance of discomfort reflect this legacy. Emotional discipline, once a social expectation, persists as an unconscious strategy for navigating social and professional landscapes, a quiet Victorian inheritance that continues to shape individual behavior. The third dimension is the cultivation of observation. Victorians constantly monitored themselves and others, learning to read microcues, subtle gestures, and tone. Social intelligence was refined through observation, anticipation, and adjustment. This legacy survives in the instinctive evaluation of social situations, the unconscious reading of body language, and the calibration of one's own behavior to maintain acceptance or avoid judgment. The skill of observing and adjusting is deeply ingrained, allowing humans to navigate complex interpersonal environments with inherited sensitivity. The fourth dimension is subtlety as strategy. Communication in Victorian society prized indirectness, understatement, and the careful balancing of meaning. Criticism was veiled, humor understated, requests implied rather than declared. Modern social interaction continues to employ these skills, demonstrating the enduring value of subtlety. Hedging statements, managing tone, and conveying intent with nuance are reflections of the same strategic subtlety cultivated in Victorian London, now encoded in cognitive and social practice rather than rulebooks. The fifth dimension is relational prudence. Relationships, courtship, marriage, friendship, familial obligations were carefully navigated through observation, hierarchy, and restraint. Emotional exposure was limited, and affection mediated by expectation. These strategies trained generations to evaluate social dynamics cautiously, anticipate outcomes, and modulate behavior for relational safety. Even today, humans instinctively manage intimacy, adjust disclosures, and negotiate boundaries, reflecting inherited Victorian relational logic. The sixth dimension is moral performance and perception. Virtue was demonstrated through behavior, decorum, and adherence to social expectation rather than through private conviction. Reputation was central. Appearance communicated character. While explicit moral policing diminished over time, the principle persists. Humans still moderate actions and expressions to signal competence, civility, and reliability. Effort, composure, and propriety continue to serve as markers of social approval, demonstrating the deep psychological and cultural embedding of Victorian moral frameworks. The seventh dimension is spatial and domestic discipline. Homes were ordered, workspaces arranged, and streets navigated with awareness of propriety. Spatial cognition, awareness of personal space, posture, and positioning was internalized. Modern behavioral patterns in urban environments, offices, and domestic spaces reflect these inherited structures. People continue to navigate physical space with subtle attention to social norms, a quiet, almost invisible inheritance of Victorian spatial discipline. The eighth dimension is the internalization of social rules. By adulthood, explicit instruction was largely unnecessary. Habits of politeness, observation, restraint, timing, and relational adjustment were embedded instinctively. Modern humans act similarly, often unaware that such behaviors are cognitive inheritances from a society that mastered self regulation, anticipation of judgment, and subtle negotiation of interpersonal dynamics. The internalized rules operate below conscious thought, influencing conduct, perception, and decision making continually. The ninth dimension is adaptability within constraint. Victorian norms were comprehensive but never exhaustive. Individuals learn to improvise, navigate ambiguity, and make judgment calls within structured social frameworks. This skill, once crucial for survival, persists as strategic social intelligence. Humans continue to operate within complex networks of expectation, balancing freedom with constraint, public perception with private desire, and personal inclination with social survival. The ability to function effectively within these parameters is an enduring cognitive and cultural inheritance. Finally, the tenth dimension is the persistent rhythm of these practices across generations. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational caution, moral performance, spatial awareness, internalized rules, temporal discipline, and adaptive skill combine to form a long, unbroken pulse. This pulse quietly structures human thought and behavior. Individuals move through social spaces, navigate relationships, manage emotional expression, and regulate time and conduct in ways shaped by these inherited rhythms. Victorian London, though materially distant, lives on invisibly, guiding interaction, shaping cognition, and embedding discipline into everyday life. The persistence of these norms is subtle, pervasive, and enduring, a testament to the invisible power of social habit, repetition, and internalized structure. They remain quietly in the gestures, thoughts, and actions of modern humans, an invisible legacy of a society that mastered the art of living within rules without ever needing to announce them, a pulse that continues to beat softly beneath the surface of contemporary life. The subtle architecture of behavior, inherited patterns, and the quiet discipline of Victorian life. We continue, slowly, letting the narrative drift like fog over the Thames, silent, unbroken, carrying with it the faint echoes of 1,850 seconds, London. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were far more than a system of etiquette. They were a subtle architecture of behavior, cognition, and emotional regulation that endured across generations. They shaped the way people thought, interacted, and navigated the world, embedding themselves into habit, instinct, and perception. Even when the outward trappings of Victorian life corsets, starched collars, and formal parlors disappeared, the underlying structures persisted quietly, guiding daily existence in ways that are often unnoticed, yet remarkably persistent. The first element of this architecture is the cultivation of self monitoring. Victorians were trained to observe themselves constantly, calibrating posture, tone, expression, and movement to conform to social expectations. This monitoring became habitual, internalized, and eventually instinctive. Today, similar patterns persist. People automatically adjust gestures, modulate voice, engage reactions in social settings, often without conscious thought. This reflexive self regulation is a direct descendant of Victorian practice, a quiet cognitive inheritance that shapes interpersonal conduct across centuries. The second element is the internalization of routine. Daily life in Victorian London was rigidly structured. Wake, breakfast, work, social visits, meals, leisure, reflection, and sleep all followed predictable rhythms. These patterns trained minds and bodies to expect order, structure, and timing. The cognitive imprint of this regimented daily life endures. Modern humans still segment days, plan activities meticulously, and value punctuality and productivity, often unconsciously reflecting the temporal discipline instilled by Victorian habit. Routines became not just practical tools, but internalized frameworks for perceiving and organizing experience. The third element is emotional discipline. Victorians prized restraint, composure, and endurance. Expressing frustration, excitement, or grief publicly was carefully moderated or suppressed. Over time, this practice became internalized, shaping the reflexive management of emotion. Today, people still moderate visible reaction, sustain composure under stress, and endure minor discomfort without external acknowledgement. This inherited emotional discipline functions as a strategy for social survival and personal navigation, subtly influencing how feelings are expressed, interpreted, and contained. The fourth element is refined observation. Social success in Victorian London required constant awareness of others. Gestures, posture, tone, and expression carried essential information. Learning to anticipate reactions, adjust behavior, and navigate subtle cues was critical. Modern social intelligence owes much to this legacy. Unconscious scanning of social environments, evaluation of appropriateness, and modulation of responses remain pervasive, reflecting an inherited capacity for observation honed over generations of structured social living. The fifth element is subtlety and indirect communication. Victorians preferred understated speech, veiled criticism, and careful negotiation of meaning. Humor was controlled, requests implied rather than stated, and conflicts managed quietly. These patterns produced generations skilled in nuance, inference, and indirect negotiation. Contemporary humans continue to communicate strategically, hedge statements, and employ subtlety in daily interaction, demonstrating the enduring power of Victorian training in social tact and measured expression. The sixth element is relational prudence. Romantic courtship, marriage, friendship, and familial interactions were all navigated carefully. Emotional exposure was limited, affection mediated, and interaction structured by hierarchy and expectation. These relational strategies cultivated discernment, caution, and strategic adjustment, traits that persist today. Modern interpersonal navigation, managing vulnerability, anticipating social consequences, and calibrating intimacy carries the cognitive imprint of Victorian relational intelligence. The seventh element is moral performance and the signaling of character. Virtue was demonstrated through conduct and appearance more than internal conviction. Reputation was paramount, and adherence to norms signaled propriety. While explicit policing has declined, the principle remains. Humans still perform moral and social cues to signal reliability, competence, and civility. Effort, restraint, and composure continue to function as markers of approval, a persistent moral framework inherited from Victorian culture. The eighth element is spatial awareness and domestic discipline. Homes were orderly, streets navigated carefully, and social spaces structured for propriety. People learned to move, sit, stand, and interact with conscious attention to environment. Modern behavioral patterns, personal space, posture, navigation in crowded settings, and domestic organization reflect this spatial and environmental training. Victorian lessons in movement, awareness, and interaction with space remain embedded in contemporary cognition and behavior. The ninth element is the internalization of rules. By adulthood, explicit instruction was largely unnecessary. Behaviors were instinctive. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, and subtle judgment became internalized patterns, shaping identity and action. Modern humans continue to operate under similar internalized frameworks, managing conduct, perception, and interaction unconsciously, guided by habits rooted in centuries old social practice. The tenth element is adaptability within constraint. Victorian rules were never exhaustive. Individuals learned to improvise, negotiate ambiguity, and act strategically. This cognitive flexibility remains crucial. Humans continue to balance freedom with social expectation, public perception with private desire, and personal preference with relational survival. Adaptive skill, subtle negotiation, and strategic flexibility are enduring elements of Victorian cognitive inheritance, shaping social and behavioral competence. Finally, these 10 elements combine to form a persistent rhythm, a subtle pulse of behavior, perception, and interaction. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational caution, moral performance, temporal discipline, spatial awareness, internalized rules, and adaptive strategy move through modern life like the faint hum of a gas lamp over foggy streets. Victorian London, though physically distant, continues to live invisibly within human cognition, shaping gestures, thought patterns, social navigation, and daily routines. Its influence is pervasive yet almost imperceptible, subtle yet unbroken, a quiet architecture of behavior and expectation that endures across centuries, guiding conduct, moderating emotion, and structuring interaction without force or conscious awareness. The pulse of Victorian habit continues, quietly, persistently, shaping lives in ways both familiar and invisible, a soft but unceasing rhythm in the long continuity of social existence. The seventh element is moral performance. Victorian society placed immense importance on the outward demonstration of moral alignment. Respectability was not only believed but performed through routine, speech, charity, restraint, and visible adherence to shared norms. Over time, this practice shaped an internal compass in which individuals monitored not only their actions but how those actions might be perceived. This legacy persists quietly today. Modern social behavior still reflects an instinct to appear reasonable, ethical, and socially aligned, even in mundane interactions. Moral behavior is often enacted through subtle signals rather than declarations, a habit inherited from Victorian emphasis on visible virtue. Together, these elements formed a durable psychological architecture. Victorian influence did not survive because it was preserved deliberately, but because it was absorbed deeply enough to become automatic. Habits replaced rules. Reflex replaced instruction. What began as cultural training became inherited instinct, passed not through textbooks, but through observation, imitation, and repetition across generations. This continuity explains why Victorian influence feels both distant and familiar. The architecture remains, even when the language has changed. Social restraint, time discipline, emotional moderation, and careful self presentation continue to guide behavior without conscious reference to their origins. They persist as background rhythms, shaping expectation and response in subtle ways. As the narrative slows, it becomes clear that history does not always end with collapse or revolution. Sometimes it simply settles. The Victorian world did not vanish. It softened, diffused, and blended into the patterns of everyday life. Its presence is no longer announced, only felt in the pauses between words, the regulation of emotion, the quiet management of self. And so we drift onward gently through the long afterlife of a culture that learned how to endure by becoming invisible. Virtue was communicated primarily through observable conduct rather than private belief. Appearance, effort, and composure signaled character. While explicit enforcement has waned, the principle remains. Humans still perform cues of propriety, reliability, and civility. Modern concern for reputation, careful modulation of behavior, and the signaling of competence all reflect the enduring Victorian logic that behavior communicates moral and social value, embedding a subtle framework of evaluation and expectation. The eighth element is spatial and domestic awareness. Homes, workplaces, and streets demanded careful attention to position, movement, and interaction. Victorian citizens learned to navigate environments with discretion, maintaining decorum and propriety. Contemporary patterns of personal space, posture, and movement, as well as domestic organization, carry the imprint of these spatial habits. Behavior responses to environment, crowding, and public spaces reflect the cognitive architecture inherited from Victorian norms. The ninth element is the internalization of rules. By adulthood, explicit guidance was often unnecessary. Habits were reflexive. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, subtle judgment, and strategic behavior became internalized as part of identity. Modern humans continue to operate under similar internalized frameworks, guided unconsciously by social expectations, relational awareness, and behavior modifying routines. The Victorian influence is embedded, quiet but persistent, in both thought and action. The tenth element is adaptability within constraint. Victorian society never provided exhaustive rules, requiring individuals to improvise, interpret, and navigate ambiguity. This produced cognitive flexibility, strategic problem solving, and the ability to balance personal preference with public expectation. Contemporary social competence, negotiation, and adaptive behavior inherit this capacity, functioning as a subtle but enduring Victorian cognitive tool. Individuals move through life guided by these 10 elements: self regulation, temporal structure, emotional restraint, observational skill, subtlety, relational prudence, moral performance, spatial awareness, internalized rules, and adaptive flexibility. Together, they create a persistent rhythm, a quiet pulse of inherited behavior, shaping thought, perception, and interaction. Victorian London, though physically distant, continues to live in human cognition, guiding gesture, expression, timing, and relational strategy. Its influence is pervasive yet invisible, subtle but unbroken, a continuous undercurrent in daily life. This silent, persistent framework forms the invisible architecture of contemporary social behavior, a soft but enduring pulse connecting present action to centuries old practice, guiding humans quietly, persistently, and almost imperceptibly through the inherited rhythm of Victorian life. Enduring manners, invisible codes, and the persistent pulse of Victorian social logic, we continue our slow journey, imagining the streets of London shrouded in early morning mist, quiet, unbroken, carrying the faint hum of life as it once was and still is, invisibly encoded in human behavior. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were never merely ornamental. They were deeply internalized frameworks of behavior, thought, and emotional management. These frameworks persisted across generations, quietly shaping how people perceived themselves, others, and their environment. They survived not through coercion or legislation, but through habitual practice, observation, repetition, and subtle reinforcement. The legacy is pervasive yet invisible, a cognitive and cultural undercurrent guiding daily life long after the era itself has ended. The first enduring aspect is disciplined self presentation. Victorians meticulously monitored posture, tone, gestures, and facial expression. This constant self awareness became instinctive, a habitual, internalized skill. Modern humans continue this practice unconsciously, adjusting body language, speech, and emotional display in social, professional, and even digital interactions. Reflexive self regulation, social calibration, and behavioral modulation are direct descendants of Victorian training, invisible yet persistent influences on thought and interaction. The second aspect is temporal mindfulness. The regimented routines of Victorian life, wake, meals, work, social visits, leisure, reflection, and sleep, produced an internalized awareness of time, sequencing, and order. Punctuality, scheduling, and structured planning are modern expressions of this temporal discipline. Even in contemporary flexible environments, humans maintain habitual attention to timing and rhythm, an inherited cognitive framework quietly organizing daily life, decision making, and social interaction. The third aspect is emotional moderation. Victorian society prized restraint. Public displays of anger, grief, or excessive joy were discouraged. Individuals learn to regulate emotion, endure discomfort silently, and present a controlled exterior. Today, subtle emotional calibration continues, shaping interpersonal behavior, conflict management, and self presentation. Emotional endurance, once socially required, persists as a habit and strategy, reflecting the enduring influence of Victorian standards of composure. The fourth aspect is observational acuity. Social navigation required constant monitoring of others. Gestures, expressions, tone, and posture all conveyed information. Learning to anticipate reactions and adjust conduct became instinctive. Contemporary humans continue to unconsciously interpret subtle cues, predict social consequences, and adapt behavior accordingly. The inherited skill of observation informs empathy, social intelligence, and adaptive interaction, a quiet Victorian cognitive legacy embedded in daily life. The fifth aspect is subtlety in communication. Directness was discouraged. Speech and action were often indirect, criticism veiled, and humor understated. Victorian training in nuance produced generations skilled in implication, inference, and strategic expression. Modern interpersonal communication still reflects this subtlety. Careful phrasing, measured tone, and hedged opinions allow people to navigate complex social environments. Subtlety is a habitual tool, refined, persistent, and largely unconscious. The sixth aspect is relational prudence. Courtship, family, friendship, and social obligations were carefully negotiated. Emotional exposure was moderated, hierarchy respected, and expectations managed. These practices taught discernment, caution, and strategic interaction. Today, humans continue to manage intimacy, evaluate relationships, and adjust behavior to balance vulnerability with safety. Victorian relational logic persists as an internalized framework for social navigation and emotional regulation. The seventh aspect is moral performance. Virtue was expressed through behavior, appearance, and adherence to expectation rather than private belief. Reputation mattered. Effort, restraint, and composure signaled character. Contemporary humans continue to perform moral and social cues to demonstrate competence, civility, and reliability. The principle that conduct communicates character remains a subtle yet powerful legacy of Victorian norms, guiding interaction and shaping perception without overt instruction. The eighth aspect is spatial and environmental awareness. Homes, offices, and streets required careful attention to movement, proximity, and posture. Individuals learned to navigate space with discretion and propriety. Modern behaviors, respect for personal space, controlled movement in public, posture management, and spatial organization reflect this inheritance. Spatial cognition, once a product of social and environmental expectation, remains embedded in human behavior. The ninth aspect is internalized social structure. By adulthood, rules were embodied rather than consciously applied. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, subtle judgment, and relational navigation became instinctive. Modern humans operate within these internalized frameworks, unconsciously, guided by habits rooted in centuries of social training. The Victorian imprint is cognitive, subtle, and enduring, shaping thought, interaction, and behavior continuously. The tenth aspect is adaptive intelligence within constraint. Victorian norms were complex but incomplete. Individuals learned to improvise, negotiate ambiguity, and act strategically. Contemporary human social competence, negotiation skills, and adaptive problem solving inherit this legacy. The ability to balance personal preference with public expectation, manage risk and perception, and navigate uncertain environments remains a cognitive skill cultivated by centuries of Victorian social practice. As these 10 elements interact, they form a persistent, subtle pulse. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational caution, moral performance, temporal discipline, spatial awareness, internalized rules, and adaptive skill move quietly through contemporary life. Victorian London, though long gone materially, continues to breathe invisibly in human cognition, social interaction, and daily behavior. Its influence is pervasive, yet nearly imperceptible, a soft undercurrent shaping gestures, perception, emotional expression, and relational strategies. The silent rhythm of Victorian social logic continues to guide conduct, organized thought, and moderate interaction, a persistent, unbroken architecture of behavior, subtle, pervasive, and enduring across generations, shaping lives long after the gas lamps have vanished, leaving only the inherited pulse of habit, observation, and quiet discipline to navigate the world. Habit, memory, and the invisible continuity of Victorian life. We continue drifting slowly as though through foggy London streets at twilight, silent, unbroken, carrying the invisible rhythms of 1850 society into the mind. By now, it is clear that Victorian social rules were never just surface level etiquette. They became deeply embedded structures of behavior, cognition, and emotional regulation, surviving far beyond the era that created them. These structures persisted through habit, observation, repetition, and subtle reinforcement, quietly shaping the ways humans navigate social interaction, self perception, and the physical world. They endured not by coercion or law, but by the slow internalization of expectation and the continuous modeling of behavior across generations. The first element of this invisible continuity is the discipline of self presentation. Victorians monitored posture, gestures, tone, and expression meticulously. This constant awareness became internalized and eventually instinctive. Today, humans unconsciously adjust body language, facial expression, and vocal tone in social, professional, and even digital spaces. Reflexive self regulation, subtle social calibration, and behavioral modulation are enduring Victorian legacies, invisible yet shaping interaction and thought in ways that often go unnoticed. The second element is the structuring of daily time. Life in Victorian London was rigidly scheduled. Wake, meals, work, social visits, leisure, reflection, and sleep all occurred with predictable regularity. Repetition reinforced temporal awareness, punctuality, and the value of time. Modern planning, scheduling, and productivity habits echo this cognitive legacy. Even in flexible contemporary life, people segment time, organize tasks, and maintain rhythm unconsciously, an inherited framework of order and temporal discipline embedded in the mind. The third element is emotional regulation. Victorian culture prized restraint and composure. Public displays of frustration, excitement, or grief were discouraged. Over time, the practice of moderation became habitual and internalized. Modern humans continue to temper visible reactions, manage emotional displays, and endure minor discomfort silently. Emotional discipline, learned over generations, functions as a subtle strategy for navigating social life and personal experience, reflecting a persistent cultural inheritance. The fourth element is the cultivation of observation. Victorians constantly monitored others, reading microexpressions, posture, tone, and gestures. Anticipating responses and adjusting behavior accordingly became instinctive. Contemporary humans unconsciously scan social environments, evaluate signals, and modulate behavior to maintain harmony or avoid disapproval. The inherited skill of social observation informs empathy, adaptability, and interpersonal intelligence, a quiet yet powerful Victorian cognitive legacy. The fifth element is subtlety in communication. Speech and action were indirect, criticism was veiled, humor understated, and negotiation carefully managed. This training produced generations skilled in nuance, inference, and strategic expression. Modern interaction still relies on these skills, hedging statements, moderating tone, and conveying intention subtly. Subtlety, once a survival tool, remains a habitual and persistent feature of social behavior, encoded in cognition and reinforced through practice. The sixth element is relational prudence. Courtship, marriage, friendship, and family life were navigated carefully, with emotional exposure moderated and hierarchy respected. These strategies trained discernment, caution, and strategic adjustment in interpersonal relationships. Today, humans continue to manage intimacy, evaluate social risk, and calibrate disclosure, reflecting the enduring cognitive template established by Victorian relational logic. The seventh element is moral performance and reputational awareness. Virtue was demonstrated through conduct and appearance rather than private belief. Reputation guided behavior. Effort, composure, and adherence to social expectation were markers of character. Modern humans continue to perform social and moral cues to signal competence, civility, and reliability. This subtle framework, though rarely explicitly acknowledged, shapes daily conduct and interpersonal evaluation, a lasting Victorian inheritance embedded in social cognition and practice. The eighth element is spatial awareness. Homes, streets, and workplaces required careful attention to posture, proximity, and movement. Navigating space with discretion and propriety was learned and internalized. Contemporary behaviors maintaining personal space, navigating crowded environments, and organizing domestic and professional spaces reflect this spatial training. The Victorian emphasis on environment, position, and movement continues to shape unconscious behavior, illustrating the durability of spatial habit and cognitive mapping across generations. The ninth element is the internalization of social rules. By adulthood, explicit instruction was often unnecessary. Habits were reflexive. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, and relational awareness became automatic, shaping identity and interaction. Modern humans operate under similar internalized frameworks unconsciously, guided by inherited norms of social behavior, subtle monitoring, and behavioral adjustment. This invisible inheritance persists as a quiet but pervasive influence on daily life and social navigation. The tenth element is adaptability within constraint. Victorian norms were complex but never complete. Individuals learned to improvise, interpret, and navigate ambiguity. This produced cognitive flexibility and strategic problem solving, skills that remain essential. Modern social competence, negotiation, and adaptive behavior are informed by this heritage. Balancing personal preference with public expectation, private desire with social survival, and freedom with structure. These adaptive strategies continue to function as subtle Victorian cognitive tools. Finally, these 10 elements converge to create a persistent, invisible rhythm, a subtle pulse of human behavior, thought, and social interaction. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational caution, moral performance, temporal discipline, spatial awareness, internalized conduct, and adaptive skill move through contemporary life quietly, like the unseen flow of gaslight over foggy streets. Victorian London, though materially distant, persists in human cognition, shaping gestures, expression, timing, and relationships. Its influence is pervasive yet imperceptible, subtle but unbroken, an invisible architecture of behavior and expectation that endures across generations, guiding thought, action, and interaction in ways that are both familiar and invisible, a soft but persistent pulse of inherited rhythm, discipline, and social intelligence that quietly orchestrates the human experience long after the original era has faded. Invisible inheritance, daily life, and the lingering patterns of Victorian social order. We continue our gentle drift as though moving along the misty, lamplit streets of London in the early hours, silent, unbroken, carrying the subtle, persistent echo of 1,850 seconds social life. By this point, it has become clear that Victorian social rules were never merely ornamental or superficial. They were deeply internalized frameworks, shaping cognition, behavior, emotional regulation, and social interaction in ways that outlived the material trappings of the era. Their endurance was not enforced through law or explicit coercion, but through repetition, observation, habit, and the subtle, almost invisible modeling of behavior across generations. These internalized rules became a quiet architecture, a rhythm that continues to structure thought, perception, and action across centuries. The first element of this enduring inheritance is habitual self monitoring. Victorians meticulously observed and adjusted posture, gestures, tone, and facial expression. This constant self awareness became internalized, eventually instinctive. Today, humans unconsciously adjust body language, speech, and emotional display in social, professional, and even digital contexts. Reflexive self regulation, subtle social calibration, and the modulation of behavior are invisible but persistent Victorian legacies, quietly shaping daily interactions and personal perception without conscious thought. The second element is temporal discipline. Life in Victorian London followed a rigid schedule: waking, meals, work, social visits, leisure, reflection, and sleep all occurred with careful regularity. Repetition reinforced an awareness of timing, sequencing, and the moral value of time. Modern humans continue to segment their days, plan tasks, and maintain punctuality, often unconsciously reflecting this cognitive imprint. Even in more flexible environments, the instinct to structure and order daily life persists, a subtle but enduring rhythm inherited from the past. The third element is emotional moderation. Public composure, endurance of frustration, and the careful management of emotional display were central to Victorian expectations. Individuals internalized these practices, producing reflexive patterns of emotional self control. Today, humans still manage visible reactions, contain minor discomfort, and calibrate responses to social cues. Emotional restraint, once socially mandated, persists as a habitual strategy for navigating relationships, work, and public life, a quiet but powerful inheritance from Victorian culture. The fourth element is observational acuity. Victorians constantly monitored others. Tone, posture, expression, and gesture all conveyed information. Anticipating reactions and adjusting conduct became instinctive. Modern humans unconsciously interpret social cues, anticipate consequences, and adjust behavior accordingly. This inherited skill underlies empathy, strategic social intelligence, and adaptive interaction, a direct cognitive legacy of the practices cultivated in Victorian London. The fifth element is subtlety in communication. Directness was often discouraged, criticism was veiled, humor understated, and negotiation carefully managed. Generations developed the ability to convey meaning indirectly, implying rather than stating, adjusting tone and phrasing for effect. Modern social communication continues to rely on subtlety, hedging opinions, moderating tone, and conveying intention tactfully are everyday manifestations of this inherited skill. Subtlety became habitual, internalized, and enduring, shaping interpersonal interaction across time. The sixth element is relational prudence. Courtship, marriage, friendship, and family interactions were carefully moderated. Emotional exposure was limited, hierarchy respected, and social expectations carefully observed. These practices taught discernment, caution, and strategic relational navigation. Today, humans manage intimacy, adjust disclosure, and anticipate consequences in ways that reflect these inherited cognitive templates, balancing vulnerability with social safety, a skill quietly passed down from Victorian predecessors. The seventh element is moral performance and reputational awareness. Virtue was demonstrated through conduct and adherence to expectation rather than private belief. Effort, composure, and adherence to norms signaled character. Modern humans continue to perform social and moral cues to demonstrate competence, civility, and reliability. The subtle framework of reputation, appearance, and conduct persists as a guiding principle, embedded in cognition and shaping interpersonal behavior across time. The eighth element is spatial and environmental awareness. Homes, streets, and workplaces required attention to posture, movement, and proximity. Navigating space with discretion and propriety was internalized. Contemporary behaviors, maintaining personal space, moving carefully through crowds, organizing domestic and professional environments reflect this spatial inheritance. Victorian emphasis on situational awareness and the choreography of movement remains embedded in human behavior, cognitive processing, and social interaction. The ninth element is the internalization of social rules. By adulthood, behaviors became reflexive. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, subtle judgment, and relational navigation were embodied rather than consciously applied. Modern humans continue to operate within these frameworks unconsciously, guided by inherited norms of behavior, subtle monitoring, and habitual adjustment. This internalization forms a quiet but pervasive influence on thought, action, and social navigation, a direct line from Victorian cognitive training to contemporary life. The tenth element is adaptive intelligence within constraint. Victorian norms were complex but never comprehensive. Individuals learned to improvise, navigate ambiguity, and act strategically within boundaries. This produced enduring cognitive flexibility. Modern humans continue to employ adaptive strategies in social, professional, and personal contexts, balancing personal preference with public expectation, freedom with structure, and private desire with relational survival. These adaptive skills are direct descendants of Victorian cognitive and social training, functioning quietly yet persistently. Finally, these 10 elements converge to form a subtle, persistent rhythm, an invisible pulse that continues to guide human behavior, thought, and social interaction. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational prudence, moral performance, temporal discipline, spatial awareness, internalized conduct, and adaptive flexibility operate together as a cohesive, long lived cognitive framework. Victorian London, though physically distant, remains alive in human cognition, behavior, and social navigation. Its influence is pervasive yet imperceptible, subtle but unbroken, quietly structuring gestures, expression, timing, relationships, and perception. The silent, persistent pulse of Victorian habit continues to move through daily life, connecting the present to centuries of practiced social intelligence, invisible yet enduring, shaping the rhythm of existence with gentle, persistent consistency. Conclusion: the quiet legacy, enduring rhythms, and Victorian life today. As we drift toward the end of our long, quiet journey, imagine once more the streets of London in the 1,850 seconds, gas lamps flickering through fog, the faint murmur of distant footsteps, the subtle choreography of human behavior unfolding in every home, parlor, and street. By now, it is abundantly clear that Victorian social rules were never just surface level etiquette or ceremonial formality. They were internalized cognitive frameworks, deeply ingrained habits, and subtle architectures of behavior that quietly shaped human life across generations. They did not require enforcement because they became self reinforcing, embedded in habit, observation, repetition, and the continual modeling of conduct. These frameworks persisted silently, shaping thought, perception, and action long after the era itself had passed, leaving a pulse of discipline, composure, and structured interaction that continues to resonate in contemporary life. The first aspect of this enduring legacy is the cultivation of self awareness and behavioral control. Victorians monitored posture, tone, gestures, expression, and even gait, adjusting each subtly to conform with social expectation. Over time, these behaviors became internalized, instinctive, and largely unconscious. Modern humans continue this legacy, constantly calibrating their own presentation across social and professional contexts, often without conscious thought. Reflexive self regulation, subtle social calibration, and behavioral modulation are invisible yet pervasive Victorian gifts shaping the flow of daily life in ways both familiar and imperceptible. The second aspect is temporal structure and rhythm. Daily life was meticulously organized. Rising, meals, work, visits, leisure, reflection, and sleep followed predictable cycles. These repeated practices trained minds and bodies to value order, punctuality, and the moral significance of time. Today, scheduling, planning, and attention to temporal structure echo this legacy. Even when society appears flexible, the cognitive imprint of Victorian routines endures, guiding perception of efficiency, daily pacing, and social coordination, quietly structuring contemporary life. The third aspect is emotional moderation and endurance. Victorians valued composure and restraint, discouraging public displays of extreme emotion. Individuals learned to manage inner feelings, endure discomfort silently, and present a controlled exterior. These patterns became internalized and habitual. Modern humans continue to moderate visible reactions, tolerate minor discomforts, and calibrate emotional expression to social context, reflecting centuries of inherited emotional discipline. Endurance and controlled expression remain markers of social competence and resilience, a subtle Victorian inheritance embedded in human behavior. The fourth aspect is observational skill. Social success required constant attention to the cues of others. Tone, gesture, posture, and expression conveyed information that needed to be read, interpreted, and responded to. Generations internalized these skills, producing instinctive social intelligence. Modern humans continue to navigate complex interactions by reading microsignals and adjusting behavior accordingly, a direct continuation of Victorian training in subtle observation and anticipation. This skill informs empathy, strategic interaction, and relational management across contexts. The fifth aspect is the cultivation of subtlety and indirect communication. Speech and action were carefully moderated, criticism veiled, humor understated, and requests implied rather than declared. Victorian training in nuance, inference, and discretion produced generations adept at negotiating meaning without overt confrontation. Contemporary communication still relies on these inherited skills. Hedging statements, measuring tone, and conveying intent with tact are habitual manifestations of subtlety learned long ago. Subtlety, internalized and habitual, continues to govern interaction, thought, and perception. The sixth aspect is relational prudence. Courtship, marriage, family, and social relations were carefully managed. Emotional exposure was limited, hierarchy respected, and social expectations navigated strategically. This cultivated caution, discernment, and adaptive relational skills. Modern humans continue to manage intimacy, anticipate outcomes, and moderate disclosures, reflecting inherited frameworks for safe, strategic social engagement. These relational patterns persist as subtle cognitive and behavioral templates, a legacy of Victorian caution and social sophistication. The seventh aspect is moral performance and reputational awareness. Virtue was expressed through action, composure, and adherence to expectation rather than through internal belief alone. Reputation mattered. Appearance, effort, and consistent behavior signaled character. Even today, humans perform social and moral cues, consciously or unconsciously, to communicate competence, civility, and reliability. The subtle framework of ethical signaling continues to structure behavior, guiding perception and interaction in ways rooted in Victorian logic of social evaluation. The eighth aspect is spatial awareness and domestic discipline. Homes, streets, and workplaces required careful attention to movement, posture, and proximity. Navigating space with discretion and propriety was internalized. Modern humans continue to manage personal space, move with awareness in public, and organize environments strategically. This spatial and environmental awareness, habitual and internalized, is a direct descendant of Victorian training, influencing cognition and behavior subtly but persistently. The ninth aspect is the internalization of social rules. By adulthood, explicit instruction was often unnecessary. Behaviors became instinctive. Politeness, timing, observation, restraint, and relational awareness were embodied rather than consciously applied. Contemporary humans continue to operate within these frameworks, guided by inherited norms, subtle monitoring, and habitual adjustment. The Victorian imprint endures quietly, shaping thought, action, and interaction across diverse contexts and generations. The tenth aspect is adaptive intelligence within constraint. Victorian social norms were complex but incomplete, requiring improvisation, negotiation, and strategic judgment. This cultivated cognitive flexibility that survives today, humans balance personal desire with public expectation, freedom with structure, and private inclination with social survival. Adaptive skill, subtle negotiation, and flexible problem solving remain central to modern social competence, a cognitive inheritance from Victorian life. As we settle into the conclusion of this long reflection, it becomes clear that the influence of Victorian social rules is pervasive, invisible, and enduring. Habit, endurance, observation, subtlety, relational prudence, moral performance, temporal discipline, spatial awareness, internalized conduct, and adaptive intelligence operate together as a persistent rhythm, shaping behavior, perception, and interaction across centuries. Victorian London, though materially distant, continues to breathe invisibly through human cognition, conduct, and social navigation. Its architecture of habit, composure, subtlety, and observation quietly orchestrates gestures, relationships, timing, and thought. The pulse of 1,850 seconds social life continues beneath the surface of contemporary existence, an invisible but unbroken current of discipline, insight, and inherited intelligence. In every gesture, every pause, every carefully calibrated word, the quiet legacy of Victorian London persists softly, unrelentingly, shaping the human experience long after the gas lamps have dimmed, the streets emptied, and the era passed, leaving only habit, observation, and the subtle rhythm of inherited social order to guide the living through the gentle, persistent architecture of life itself.